What if 3 quiet hours could change how you see the world? In the stillness of Zen, even the smallest story can open the heart and calm the mind. These peaceful teachings are not loud or grand. They whisper truth like wind through bamboo. As you listen, the rush of life begins to fade. Worries soften, thoughts slow down. Zen shows us that peace doesn't need effort, it just needs space. Let these stories guide you back to yourself, one calm breath at a time. The Empty Teacup of Master Kido. The idea behind this story is about humility, learning, and the importance of letting go of pride in order to truly receive wisdom. It teaches that we must empty ourselves of ego and assumptions if we wish to grow. In a quiet mountain village, far from the noise of city life, lived Master Kido, a Zen teacher known for his silence more than his speech. He rarely offered answers, but people still came from far away to sit with him, hoping for clarity. One day, a young scholar arrived. He had read hundreds of books on philosophy and religion. With pride in his voice and confidence in his step, he bowed respectfully to Master Kido and said, "I've studied many teachings and written much, but I've heard you can teach the one truth that cannot be found in books." Master Kido only nodded and invited him in. They sat in silence for a while before the master began to pour tea into a small porcelain cup in front of the scholar. He poured slowly, gently, as steam rose into the air. The scholar watched, but even as the tea reached the rim of the cup, Master Kido kept pouring. It began to spill over the sides and onto the wooden floor. "Master," the scholar exclaimed, "the cup is full, no more can go in." Only then did Kido stop pouring. He looked calmly at the young man and said softly, "You are like this cup, full of your own opinions, conclusions, and noise. How can I show you the quiet truth if you have no space to receive it?" The scholar's face changed. His confidence melted into humility. In that moment, without another word, he understood. He bowed again this time, not as a proud student, but as an empty vessel ready to listen. Moral of the story: to truly learn, we must first let go. An open mind begins with an empty cup. Ego, pride, and the need to be right are barriers to peace and understanding. When we release them, we create space for wisdom to enter. In silence, in surrender, the deepest truths reveal themselves not in noise, but in stillness. The next story is called The Silent Wind of Mount Io. This story speaks about inner stillness, presence, and the calm that arises when we let go of the need to control or understand everything. It reminds us that peace is not found by grasping at life's mysteries, but by sitting quietly with them, even when they make no sound. Long ago, at the base of Mount Io, where sulfur steamed gently from the earth and the wind whispered through crooked pines, there was a monk named Riku who had journeyed for days to meet an old hermit. The hermit, Master Shunyo, was said to speak rarely and teach only through silence. Many seekers had climbed the mountain only to leave disappointed by his wordlessness, but Riku was not like them. He had lost his appetite for knowledge written on scrolls. He wanted to feel something real. When he arrived at the weathered hut, Master Shunyo was tending a kettle over hot stones. He didn't speak, didn't even look up, but motioned for Riku to sit. The two sat in silence, with only the soft crackling of fire and distant mountain winds filling the space between them. Time passed. 1 hour, then another. Riku's legs ached, and his mind itched for a teaching. Still, Shunyo said nothing. At last, Riku spoke. "Master," he whispered, almost apologetically, "I have walked far. I hoped for even one word to guide me." The old hermit looked at him gently, then pointed to the open doorway, where the wind moved the grass in slow waves. The mountain was utterly quiet, yet alive with presence. "Do you hear it?" Shunyo asked softly. "Hear what?" Riku replied, straining. "The wind that makes no sound, said the hermit. "It moves, but it does not shout. It carries no meaning, but it holds all truth. Sit with it, and you'll understand more than words can teach." Something in Riku broke open. He stopped searching and simply listened, not for a sound, but for the silence itself. In that moment, he felt an ache in his chest disappear. The questions stopped. He did not find answers, but he no longer needed them. Moral of the story: peace does not always come through knowing. Sometimes it comes through simply being. Like the wind that moves in silence, the truth is not always loud. When we stop chasing meaning and let the moment be enough, stillness enters and with it a deeper kind of understanding. The next story is called Stone Lantern Without Flame. This story speaks to the quiet strength of presence and the light we carry even when no one sees it. It reminds us that purpose is not always about being noticed, but about being steady and real, even in darkness. Sometimes, the most powerful light is the one that does not burn. In the courtyard of a forgotten temple deep in the mountains of Kyoto, there stood an old stone lantern. It had no flame, no oil, and no wick. For many years, it had been weathered by snow, rain, and sun. Moss crept up its sides. Travelers passed it without notice. Monks swept around it but never lit it. It was simply threesolent, still, and seemingly empty of use. One autumn morning, a young monk named Daiji arrived at the temple. He was assigned to care for the garden and grounds. Each day he worked hard, but inside he wrestled with doubt. "I want to be useful," he confided to the head monk. "I want to be like those who guide others, or teach, or shine brightly." The head monk smiled, said nothing, and pointed to the old lantern. "Then begin there." Daiji looked puzzled. "But the lantern has no flame." Still, the head monk said, "Sit with it, learn from it." So each day, Daiji sat beside the stone lantern after his chores. At first, it felt foolish. He stared at a hollow place meant for fire. But over time, he began to notice things. How the light of the moon gently touched its surface. How birds rested on its top as if it were a safe haven. How even in its stillness, it held space for shadow, for light, for the passing of seasons. One cold evening, a traveler arrived at the temple after sunset. The monk greeted him with warm tea and a blanket. "How did you find your way here in the dark?" Daiji asked. The traveler smiled, pointing to the old lantern. "I saw the outline of the stone and knew I was close to shelter. It may not burn, but its shape was enough." Daiji felt tears in his eyes. The lantern had guided someone not by flame, but by presence. Moral of the story: you do not need to burn brightly to be meaningful. Some lights are quiet, some guidance comes through presence, not words. Even when we feel unseen, our stillness can offer warmth, safety, and peace to others. The next story is called A Mirror That Faces the Moon. This story teaches about clarity, reflection, and the nature of truth. It reminds us that just like a mirror facing the moon, we don't need to hold on to the light to shine. True peace comes when we stop trying to grasp life and simply reflect it as it is, without distortion, without clinging, without fear. In a quiet forest temple near a still lake, there was a small meditation hall used only at night. Inside it, high on the wall, hung a round bronze mirror. The monk said it had been there for generations. It did not reflect the people inside. The hullet faced outward, always turned toward the open window, toward the sky. One evening, a novice named Sora approached the old master and asked, "Why is the mirror turned away from us? Shouldn't it help us reflect on ourselves?" The master closed his eyes and replied gently, "Sit with it when the moon is full." Days passed, and then came the full moon. That night, the hall filled with soft silver light. Sora sat alone and looked at the mirror. The moon, high and silent in the sky, appeared perfectly inside it, glowing, clear, complete. But the mirror held nothing. It gave no warmth, no pull. It simply reflected. Sora visited the mirror every night after that, waiting for it to reflect again. But when clouds covered the sky, it remained blank. When rain came, it shimmered faintly with shadow. It never changed what was outside. It never added or took away. One night, Sora whispered, "Is this the teaching?" The master, who had quietly entered the hall, replied, "Yes, the moon is the world. The mirror is your mind. When your mind is still, when it doesn't grasp, judge, or cling it, reflects the world as it truly is. No more, no less. You do not need to hold the moon to receive its light." Sora bowed deeply. For the first time, he felt a quiet peace inside, not because he had found something, but because he had stopped chasing what was already there. Moral of the story: a peaceful mind does not cling or distort, it reflects. Like a mirror facing the moon, we shine not by trying, but by simply being clear and still. In that stillness, life reveals itself, and in that quiet reflection, we find the light. The next story is called The Mute Novice's Awakening. This story reveals the deep power of silence, the value of presence over words, and the truth that awakening does not require speech, it requires seeing clearly. It teaches us that stillness and awareness can say more than even the wisest teachings, and that peace often blossoms in the spaces where language falls away. At a temple hidden within a misty pine forest, there lived a novice named Kenji. He had been born without a voice and had never spoken a word. Though the monks treated him kindly, many believed he could never truly understand the Dharma. After all, he could not ask questions, could not recite chants, and could not debate sutras. They called him the Silent One, not unkindly, but as if silence were a limitation. Kenji, however, watched everything. He rose before the others, swept the temple grounds, prepared offerings, and sat in meditation without ever drawing attention. While others studied scriptures, Kenji watched the morning light move across the floor. While others argued over meaning, Kenji walked quietly through the garden, feeling the wind on his skin and the weight of each step. One day, a visiting monk arrived from a distant monastery. Known for his sharp intellect, he challenged the monks at Kenji's temple with difficult questions. "What is the true path?" he asked. "What is awakening without knowledge?" No one could answer with certainty. The abbot finally turned to Kenji and motioned for him to respond, not to speak, but to show. Kenji bowed. Then, in complete silence, he walked to the garden and picked up a single fallen leaf. He held it gently in both hands and lifted it toward the sun. The light passed through it, illuminating its delicate veins. The wind stirred, and the leaf slipped from his hands, floating away. The visiting monk watched with wide eyes. Slowly, he placed his palms together and bowed deeply. He said nothing. He had received the answer. Later, one of the younger monks asked the abbot, "What did he say with that leaf?" The abbot smiled and replied, "He said everything." Moral of the story: peace and wisdom do not always come through words. Sometimes the deepest truths are felt, not spoken. Silence can be the loudest teaching. When we are fully present, we don't need to explain, we become the teaching. The next story is called When the Ink Froze in the Sutra Room. This story teaches about quiet perseverance, devotion without expectation, and the deep warmth that can rise even in life's coldest moments. It reminds us that discipline is not about perfection or speed, but about returning, gently and patiently, no matter the season of the heart. In the high mountains of northern Japan, winter came like a breath held too long, cold, still and heavy. The old temple there was used to the snow, but this winter was harsher than most. The ink in the calligraphy bowls froze before the monks could finish writing. and their breath curled in white puffs as they chanted sutras each morning. In a small wooden room at the edge of the temple grounds, the youngest monk, Renji, had been tasked with copying sacred texts by hand. It was said that every stroke of the brush helped deepen one's understanding of the Dharma. But Renji was struggling. His fingers stiffened in the cold. The ink froze in its dish. His lines blurred. He grew frustrated and tired. One morning, his teacher found him sitting still, staring at his blank scroll. "The ink is frozen," Renji said softly, "and so is my mind. How can I write when nothing flows?" The teacher nodded, then sat beside him in silence. After a while, he said, "In spring, ink flows easily. In winter, it must be warmed. So it is with your mind. You do not fail because it is cold. You grow stronger by learning how to stay." The next day, Renji rose before the sun. He carried the inkstone into his robe, close to his body, warming it with his own breath. When he finally sat to write, the ink was thick but usable. His strokes were not perfect, but they were steady. Every morning after that, he did the same. Spring eventually arrived, and with it, warmth. But by then, Renji had found his own heater, quiet fire that came not from the air, but from his devotion. He never complained again about the cold. It had become his teacher. Moral of the story: conditions will not always be easy. Peace and clarity do not always come when we want them to. But when we stay present through the cold, with patience and care, we discover that warmth can rise from within. Even frozen ink can flow if we remain, and if we continue, gently, with heart. The next story is called Master Rengetsu's Paper Umbrella. This story teaches the beauty of gentleness, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from embracing the moment, just as it is. It reminds us that even the most fragile things, a paper umbrella, a soft word, a passing smile, can carry the spirit of peace if they are held with care and love. Rengetsu was not a monk in the usual sense. She was a poet, a calligrapher, and a traveler. She had lost much in her life, family, home, and comfort, but never her grace. Wherever she went, she carried a paper umbrella, handmade and simple. It was delicate, barely strong enough to hold back the rain, yet it followed her through mountains, forests, and city streets. One cold spring morning, while walking through the quiet lanes of a village, Rengetsu passed by a group of boys playing. Her long robe flowed, and the paper umbrella bobbed gently in her hand. The boys stared at her curiously. One of them, bold and careless, ran up and snatched the umbrella from her grip. He waved it in the air, laughing, not knowing who she was. The umbrella tore in the wind. Rain had begun to fall. The other children froze. They waited for anger, for scolding, for shame. But Rengetsu only stepped closer, her face calm, eyes soft. She gently took the broken umbrella back and opened it, even though it was now tattered and bent. "Do not be afraid," she said kindly. "It was only paper, and paper teaches us how to let go." She handed the boy a poem she had written that morning, a few lines in soft ink. "Even in the rain, this umbrella opens, a kindness unbroken." The boy stood quietly, not understanding every word, but feeling something shift inside. Years later, he would recall that moment, not the rain, not the game, but the gentle way. A broken umbrella became a lesson in compassion. Moral of the story: true peace isn't loud or strong. It's gentle. It doesn't hold tightly or punish, it softens. Even fragile things can carry great wisdom. When we meet life's troubles with kindness instead of anger, even broken things can become beautiful. The next story is called The Koan Buried in Ashes. This story teaches that awakening sometimes comes not through understanding, but through loss. When life burns down the things we cling to, we often search for meaning in the ashes. Yet, in that quiet ruin, something deeper can emerge, a truth that was always there, waiting to be uncovered. In a remote Zen temple tucked into the hills of Nara, there was once a treasured scroll. Upon it was written a single koan, passed down through 7 generations of masters. It was not a famous koan, but it held deep meaning for the monks who studied there. It was their heart center, something they all returned to in their quiet moments. One spring, a fire broke out in the nearby forest. Carried by strong winds, flames reached the outer halls of the temple before the monks could respond. They fought to save the library and shrine, carrying buckets of water in silence, tears streaking through soot-covered faces. But by morning, the room that held the scroll was reduced to ash. The monks gathered around the blackened remains. Some wept, others stood motionless. The abbot, an old master named Tetsugan, knelt where the scroll had been kept. He said nothing for a long time. Then one monk asked, "Master, what do we study now that the koan is gone?" Master Tetsugan ran his fingers through the ashes, lifted a handful, and let them fall through his hand like grey snow. "You study this," he said softly. "You study what remains when nothing remains." The monks didn't understand at first. Some grew angry, feeling that something sacred had been lost forever. But in the days that followed, their practice deepened. Without the scroll to rely on, they sat more quietly. They listened more closely. They faced the emptiness that had always been just beneath the words. Weeks later, while clearing the debris, Ren, a novice monk, found a piece of charred wood with part of the scroll still faintly visible. The ink was blurred, the words unreadable. But instead of showing it to the others, he placed it back in the ashes. He had understood. The koan had never been in the scroll. It had always been in the heart that searched for it. Moral of the story: true understanding is not found in words or objects, but in the silent space left behind when they're gone. Sometimes what we lose clears the way for what we were always meant to find. When we let go of form, the real teaching can rise quietly from the ashes. The next story is called Tea Leaves, Whisper to the Crickets. This story is about the quiet connection between the inner world and the outer world. It teaches us that deep listening beyond sound, beyond word scan, awaken a sense of unity with all things. When the mind is still, even the smallest moment becomes sacred. Peace is not something we wait for, it's something we notice, in silence, in detail, in the gentle language of life itself. In the southern countryside, where tall grasses swayed and the evenings were thick with summer air, there lived an old tea master named Haru. He was known not for grand ceremonies or perfect movements, but for the way he poured tea as if it were prayer. People said his tea tasted like calmness itself. A young student named Emmy came to study with him, hoping to learn the secret of his peace. She expected instructions, rituals, rules, but Haru gave none. Every morning they sat in the tea house and listened to the steam rise. Every evening they drank tea in silence, surrounded by the sound of crickets. One night, after many weeks, Emmy broke the silence. "Master," she asked softly, "why do we listen so long before we speak? What are we listening for?" Haru smiled and picked up the small wooden scoop. "When I was young," he said, "I tried to make the tea loud, perfect, impressive, but the leaves always spoke too softly for me to hear. It wasn't until I learned to sit with the crickets that I began to understand." He held out the bowl of tea to her and said, "Drink this slowly, and listen not just with your ears, but with your breath, with your skin. Listen for what speaks beneath the silence." Emmy took a sip. The tea was light, earthy, and warm. As she drank, she heard the chirping of crickets not as background noise, but as part of the tea itself, as if the leaves and the night were speaking together. Her mind grew quiet. In that quiet, she felt a stillness she had never known, and a connection to everything around her. The crickets, the tea, the breath, the breeze-nothing was separate. Moral of the story: peace begins with listening, not just to words, but to the life unfolding in each moment. When we quiet the mind, we hear the world in a new way. Even tea leaves whisper, even crickets speak. All of life becomes a conversation in stillness. The next story is called The Rice Pot That Rang the Bell. This story teaches that even the smallest actions, done with mindfulness, can carry the sound of awakening. It reminds us that enlightenment doesn't only arrive in temples or during long meditation sit, can be found in the humble clatter of daily life, if we are truly present. In a modest temple on the edge of a farming village, morning always began the same way. Before the sun rose, a monk would strike the temple bell to wake everyone for meditation. Its deep, warm tone rolled through the mist, calling monks and farmers alike into the new day. One morning, the bell did not ring. The bell striker, an elder monk named Jorin, had fallen ill and could not rise. The temple remained quiet. But in the kitchen, a young monk named Katsu was already preparing the morning rice. He had not heard the bell but followed his habit, rising early, lighting the fire, and beginning his work with care. As he lifted the iron rice pot from the stove, it slipped slightly from his hand and struck the edge of the wooden table with a clear, echoing sound, sharp, round, and full. The pot rang once, and then the room was still. In the meditation hall, monks opened their eyes. They had heard something, not the temple bell, but something just as deep. Some thought it was a bell from another temple, others thought they imagined it. Still, without speaking, they rose and took their seats for morning practice. Later, the abbot asked Katsu if he had struck anything. Embarrassed, Katsu explained that the sound had come from the rice pot. He bowed, apologizing for the accident. The abbot smiled and said, "The bell did ring today, not by tradition, but by truth." The monks reflected on this quietly. That morning, Zazen felt differentless, forced, more alive. Katsu, too, began to understand. It was not about ringing the right bell, but about doing the right thing with care. His attention had been so full that even a simple task became sacred. Moral of the story: awakening doesn't wait for ceremony. Even the clink of a pot, touched with presence, can become the sound of truth. When we do ordinary things with full attention and open heart, they echo with the same depth as the greatest teachings. The next story is called Master Ban's Shoes by the Stream. This story teaches the value of presence, simplicity, and letting go of what no longer serves. It reminds us that peace does not live in what we carry, but in what we are willing to leave behind. Sometimes, the path forward becomes clear only when we stop clinging to what once seemed necessary. Master Ban was known across the region not for his sermons or sutras, but for the way he walked. He never seemed in a hurry, yet he arrived before the sun rose. He never looked lost, yet he rarely asked for directions. And always, he wore the same worn-out pair of straw-soled shoes, patched so many times they were more thread than fabric. One day, a student named Kenta followed Master Ban on one of his morning walks. They wandered through tall grass, past fields ready for harvest, and down a path that led to a small stream just outside the village. The air was cool, and the water moved gently over the rocks, soft and steady. Master Ban sat by the stream and quietly removed his shoes. Kenta watched him rinse his feet, then pause. Without a word, the master placed the shoes beside a stone, neatly aligned, and stood barefoot on the earth. "Master," Kenta asked, "aren't you going to put your shoes back on?" "No," Ban replied softly. "They have walked with me long enough. Today, I go on without them." Kenta was confused. "But they've protected your feet for years. Don't they still have use?" Master Ban smiled and looked at the shoes. "Yes, but they've also become part of my identity, and identity can become weight, Sometimes, to step freely, we must leave behind what once helped us walk. The stream flowed on in silence. Ban began to walk, slowly, barefoot through the cool grass. Kenta stayed behind, staring at the shoes, suddenly aware of all the things he carried, his doubts, his titles, his pridyan, how heavy they had become. Moral of the story: peace is not found in what we hold on to, but in what we're willing to set down. When we walk without clinging to who we think we are, we become light. And in that lightness, the path becomes clear even without shoes. The next story is called Peach Blossoms in the Abbot's Sleeve. This story speaks of the unexpected beauty that arises when we stop chasing answers and allow life to unfold. It teaches that awakening can come not through effort or study, but in a single, quiet moment of seeing when the mind is still and the heart is open. In early spring, when the snow had only just melted from the temple paths, a young monk named Haru approached the abbot with a heavy heart. Haru had been meditating for months without feeling any different. He had read sutras, recited chants, fasted, and sat in silence. Still, he felt no closer to understanding. One morning, he waited outside the abbot's quarters and bowed as the old man stepped into the morning light. The abbot, known simply as Master Kizan, was carrying nothing but a long robe draped over his arm. As he walked past, Haru stood and asked, "Master, please, when will I awaken? I've done everything. Why can't I see?" Master Kizan paused, but did not answer. He only smiled gently and continued walking toward the garden. Haru followed, hoping for a teaching. The path curved beneath bare trees and through a bamboo gate. Then, just as they passed beneath a low branch, a gust of wind swept through, loosening a small cluster of peach blossoms overhead. The soft pink petals danced in the air like snowflakes, swirling gently downward. One blossom landed in the fold of Master Kizan's sleeve. He stopped, looked at it, and then turned to Haru. He said nothing, only lifted his arm so Haru could see the small flower resting there. And in that moment, Haru felt his breath catch. Something shifted inside him, not in thought, but in stillness. His frustration, his effort, his questions, all of it dissolved. The world felt light, and so did he. Master Kizan simply walked on, the blossom still in his sleeve, as if it had always been there. Haru did not speak again that day. He did not need to. Moral of the story: enlightenment is not always the result of effort. Sometimes it arrives like a falling blossom, soft, unnoticed, and without warning. When we stop striving, when we're simply present, even the smallest moment can reveal everything. Peace does not shout. It falls quietly and lands where the heart is ready. The next story is called When a Cat Entered Zazen. This story reveals the beauty of unexpected presence, the letting go of control, and how true stillness welcomes all things without resistance. It reminds us that peace is not the absence of disturbance, but the openness to let every moment be just as it is, even when it arrives on soft paws. In a quiet Zen temple nestled between the hills and pines, the monks gathered each dawn for zazen-silent sitting meditation. The hall was clean, bare, and precise. Every cushion was aligned, every robe folded neatly. The silence in the room felt like a sacred breath held still between heaven and earth. One morning, as the bell rang to begin, a small grey cat slipped through the sliding door. No one saw where it came from. It walked calmly across the wooden floor, tail raised, eyes curious. Some monks opened their eyes. A few flinched, but no one moved. The cat wandered slowly, brushing against robes, stepping over folded legs. Then, without hesitation, it climbed into the lap of an old monk named Sogen and curled into a small, warm ball. Sogen did not react. He simply continued breathing, eyes soft, posture unshaken. The cat purred, a gentle hum in the hush of the hall. Some monks felt distracted, some felt annoyed. One even struggled to suppress a laugh. After the sitting ended, the head monk approached Sogen and asked, "Why didn't you move the cat?" It broke the silence. Sogen smiled and replied, "It entered the silence. It only disturbed those who tried to resist it." The monks were quiet. Some reflected on how they had tried to mentally push the cat away, tightening their breath, clinging to the idea of perfect stillness. But the cat had simply been part of the moment. Not good, not bad, just present. From that day on, the cat was welcome during Zazen. It never came to disrupt, it came to join. And over time, the monks learned to sit not against the world, but within it. Even when soft paws wandered through their silence, their peace remained untouched. Moral of the story: peace is not control, it's acceptance. When we stop resisting the world and allow each moment to arrive without judgment, we remain still even as life moves gently through us. True silence is not fragile. It welcomes everything, even a cat. The next story is called The Crack in the Temple Roof. This story is about embracing imperfection and learning that the things we try hardest to fix or hide may be the very paths through which light enters. It teaches that peace is not found in flawless surroundings, but in the way we meet what is broken with presence, compassion, and acceptance. High in the misty hills of Nagano, there stood an old Zen temple made of cedar and stone. The monks who lived there were few, and the structure itself had aged with time. Walls bowed slightly, paper doors yellowed, and on rainy days, water would sometimes find its way in. At the heart of the temple was the meditation hall, where a single wooden beam stretched overhead. One day, after a season of heavy snow, a visible crack appeared in the beam. It wasn't large, but it ran across the ceiling like a line in the sky. Some monks worried. Others said it must be repaired at once. A younger monk named Taiko became especially troubled. "This is a sacred place," he said. "We must not let it fall into ruin." The abbot, a quiet man with weathered hands and kind eyes, listened to their concerns. He nodded, but made no move to order repairs. Instead, he said, "Let us sit with it for now." Days passed, then weeks. Rain came, snow melted, and light returned. Still, the crack remained. But something strange began to happen. Each morning, just before sunrise, the light would stream through that narrow crack and cast a beam across the tatami mats, thin, golden, and alive. The monks began to notice it. Some rose early just to sit in its glow. The light, filtered through the imperfection, seemed to carry a kind of peace. It arrived without effort, without plan. It simply came. One morning, Taiko bowed before the abbot and said, "I understand now. The crack is not a flaw, it's a gift." The abbot smiled. "It always was," he said. "You just needed to stop seeing it as something wrong." Moral of the story: we spend much of life trying to fix or hide what we think is broken, but often it's through these very cracks that truth and beauty shine. Imperfection is not something to fear, it's the doorway through which presence enters, softly, like light through an old roof. The next story is called Clouds Carved into the Altar. This story speaks of impermanence, devotion, and the quiet grace in honoring what cannot stay. It teaches us that even fleeting things like cloud scan leave lasting impressions, not because they remain, but because we are present enough to see their beauty as they pass. Peace, then, comes not from holding on, but from fully honoring what moves through us. At a temple perched high above the valley, where mist touched the treetops and the sky changed color by the hour, there stood an old altar made of weathered cedar. Unlike most altars carved with dragons, lotus flowers, or fierce guardians, this one had only cloud soft, flowing, and nearly invisible at first glance. They wound across the surface like gentle waves, subtle and quiet. No one knew who had carved them. Even the oldest monk could only say, "They've always been here." A young nun named Eiko arrived to study at the temple. She was diligent, focused, and quietly ambitious. She swept the paths, recited sutras, and practiced meditation with discipline. But she couldn't understand the altar. "Why clouds?" she asked one day. "They vanish so quickly. Shouldn't we honor something more eternal?" The abbot said nothing. He only handed her a cloth and motioned to the altar. "Dust it slowly. Watch carefully." So each morning, Eiko wiped the wood clean, and each morning the light shifted. The clouds, barely noticeable the day before, would suddenly reveal themselves curving around corners, disappearing into the grain. Some days they looked like waves, other days like smoke. Sometimes they disappeared completely in shadow, only to reappear when the sun moved a little. Weeks passed. One morning, as Eiko dusted the altar, clouds filled the sky, outside real ones, heavy with rain. She looked at the carving, then at the sky, and something inside her softened. The clouds outside were moving, changing, vanishing. And yet, there they were again, in the wood-carved, remembered, honored. She finally understood. The clouds were not there to last. They were there to be seen. Moral of the story: peace comes when we stop clinging to what fades and begin to honor what passes through us. Even the most fleeting things like clouds can be sacred, if we are present enough to notice them. Nothing needs to stay forever to be worthy of reverence. The next story is called The Bell That Refused to Echo. This story speaks about control, expectation, and the quiet truth that not everything answers us in the way we want. It teaches that peace comes not from forcing life to respond, but from learning to hear what is already being said even in silence. There was once a temple perched above a cliffside, known for a great bronze bell that hung in its tower. It was said the bell could echo across the sea, heard by fishermen miles away. Pilgrims would come just to hear its sound, deep, round, and full of life. A young monk named Daishin was given the honor of ringing the bell for the first time. He had practiced for days, carefully studying the right stance, the correct rhythm, the ceremonial bow. He dreamed of hearing that long, beautiful echo roll into the sky. The day came. With all the temple watching, Daishin struck the bell with the wooden beam. But to his horror, the bell gave only a dull, hollow, thud-no echo, no sound that carried. Just one flat note that faded too quickly. He struck it again, harder. Still, the sound fell short. His face turned red. He turned to the abbot in shame. "I've failed," he said. "I don't know what I did wrong." The abbot walked slowly to the bell and touched it gently. "This morning," he said, "the fog is thick. The air is heavy. The bell has not failed. It simply echoes in a different way." Daishin looked around. He noticed the silence beyond the tower, the thick mist hanging over the cliffs, soft and unmoving. There was no wind to carry the sound, no sky to return it, only stillness. And in that stillness, he began to hear other things: the breath of the other monks, the rustle of robes, the soft creak of the bell's rope. In trying so hard to hear the echo, he had missed everything else. The abbot placed a hand on Daishin's shoulder. "Some days, the bell will not echo. That does not mean it did not speak." Moral of the story: life does not always respond the way we expect. Sometimes, the world answers with silence. But that silence is not emptiness, it is an invitation to listen more deeply. When we release control, we begin to hear what has been waiting all along. The next story is called Koan of the Leaf That Never Fell. This story reveals the mystery of attachment, letting go, and the quiet illusions we hold about control and timing. It teaches that not everything needs to be resolved, answered, or completed in the way we expect. Some truths unfold like autumn softly, incompletely, and perfectly so. In a forest temple surrounded by tall maples, the seasons were teachers. In spring, the monks watched the blossoms. In summer, they listened to the wind. But it was autumn that stirred the deepest silence. Every year, the temple held a ceremony when the last leaf fell from the trees. It marked the full release of the season nature's soft bow to impermanence. One year, a young monk named Tetsu was chosen to ring the bell the moment the final leaf dropped. He sat under the oldest maple tree, wrapped in his robe, waiting. Days passed. The monks watched leaves spin and fall around him. The ground turned gold, then brown, then bare. But one single leaf remained high, near the top, clinging gently to a slender branch. Tetsu waited, breath held by each gust of wind. But the leaf stayed. Monks passed by, whispering, "Surely tomorrow." But tomorrow came again and again, and still the leaf remained. Some began to laugh, others grew impatient, but Tetsu stayed. After 2 weeks, the abbot visited him and said, "Why do you sit here? The season has already turned." Tetsu looked up and answered, "The last leaf has not fallen." The abbot nodded once. "Perhaps the leaf is not late, perhaps you are early." The next morning, frost covered the ground. The leaf was still there, but something inside Tetsu had changed. He stopped watching the leaf with expectation. He stopped waiting for it to fall. He simply sat, breathing with it, being with it. And in that stillness, a kind of peace bloomed, no longer tied to whether the leaf would drop or stay. That evening, a strong wind blew through the trees. Tetsu did not look up. He smiled, knowing that the falling or not falling no longer mattered. Moral of the story: peace does not come when life bends to our timing. It comes when we release the need to know when or how. Some things will fall, some things will stay. True stillness is not waiting for change, but resting fully in the moment, whether the leaf falls or not. The next story is called The Novice Who Bowed to Shadows. This story reveals the quiet truth about fear, illusion, and humility. It teaches that much of what disturbs our peace is not the world itself, but what we believe about it. When we face our shadows with reverence instead of resistance, they often dissolve into light. In the southern wing of a secluded Zen monastery, there was a long, narrow hallway lit only by the soft glow of paper lanterns. The path led to the meditation room, and each night the monks would walk it in silence before zazen. Among them was a novice named Jen. He was bright, sincere, and eager to learn, but he carried an old fear in his heart, a fear of darkness. Though he never said it aloud, his steps would quicken when the lights grew dim. One evening, after an especially long day of work, Jen was the last to leave the hall. As he passed through the corridor alone, he noticed strange shadows moving along the wall stall, bending, unfamiliar. He froze. His heart pounded. For a moment, he wanted to run. But then, from somewhere deep within, something softer arose. He remembered the teachings. Fear is the mind not seeing clearly. So instead of fleeing, Jen stopped. He bowed, not to a master, not to a statue, but to the shadow itself. Slowly, gently, he pressed his palms together and offered the same respect he would to the Buddha. The shadows did not vanish, but something shifted inside him. They no longer seemed threatening. He stepped forward, bowing again and again. With each breath, the fear began to loosen. As he approached the end of the hall, he saw the source of the shapes, the sleeves of robes hanging to dry, gently moving in the breeze. They had never been anything else. The next day, when the abbot heard what Jen had done, he simply said, "You bowed not to shadows, but to your own mind. That is the deepest bow of all." Moral of the story: we often fear what we do not understand, and we resist what we cannot see clearly. But when we meet our fears with presence and humility, they lose their power. Sometimes, peace begins with a single bow even to the darkest part of ourselves. The next story is called A Fly on the Sutra Scroll. This story teaches us about distraction, awareness, and the surprising ways truth reveals itself when we stop resisting what seems small or unwanted. It reminds us that peace is not found by avoiding the world, but by seeing clearly. Even the things that land in the middle of our sacred space can become teachers if we are willing to look with open eyes. In a quiet study room of a mountain temple, where the scent of old paper and cedar filled the air, an elderly monk named Jikan sat copying sutras by hand. It was a task he performed every morning, without fail, each stroke of the brush steady, each line of ink a silent bow to the teachings of the Buddha. One summer morning, as the sun poured softly through the paper windows, a small black fly began to circle the room. Jikan noticed it but said nothing. He dipped his brush into the inkstone and continued writing. The fly landed on the scroll, right in the center of a passage about mindfulness. It crawled across the sacred words, leaving tiny prints on the drying ink. Jikan paused. His breath remained calm, his hand still. Another monk watching from across the room whispered, "Shall I chase it away?" But Jikan shook his head. "Let it be," he said. The fly walked along the scroll for a while, then lifted off and disappeared toward the window. The monk looked confused. "Master, why did you let it walk over the words? It could have ruined them." Jikan smiled, eyes soft. The fly is not outside the Dharma. It too moves through the teachings, unaware, just like us. It only becomes a problem when we think it shouldn't be there. He showed the scroll to the monk. The marks the fly left were faint, but still their tiny, scattered impressions. Instead of ruining the passage, they had blended with the ink like a quiet echo of life itself. Sometimes, Jikan said, the fly teaches better than the words. Moral of the story: peace comes not from pushing away what distracts us, but from seeing it as part of the whole. Even small annoyances can become part of the path when we meet them without judgment. When we let go of resistance, everything, even a fly, can reveal truth. The next story is called Silence Between Two Footsteps. This story teaches the power of stillness, not just the kind we find when we stop, but the kind that lives within movement. It reminds us that peace is not only found in quiet places, but in the spaces between each moment, each breath, each step. At a Zen temple hidden between mountain trails and pine forests, a retreat was held every spring for walking meditation. Monks and visitors would gather barefoot to walk in silence along a circular stone path, focusing deeply on each step. One year, a restless young traveler named Haku joined the retreat. He was new to Zen and full of questions. What is enlightenment? How do I quiet my mind? When will I feel peace? Though told to walk and observe, his thoughts raced with every step. On the third morning, during walking meditation, Haku approached the old master, who stood quietly under a plum tree. "Master," he whispered, "I take each step as carefully as I can, but I still feel noisy inside. What am I doing wrong?" The master didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for Haku to walk beside him. Together, they took 3 slow steps across the gravel path. Then the master stopped, turned, and said softly, "You are listening for peace in the wrong place." Haku furrowed his brow. "I don't understand." The master smiled and whispered, "Don't listen to your steps. Listen between them." Puzzled, Haku began walking again, this time with a deeper kind of attention. He noticed the sound of his foot meeting the earth. Then, a pause, a soft stillness before the next foot touched down. That space, barely a breath, was silent, wide, alive. In that silence, something opened. The noise in his head softened. He began to feel grounded, not just in body, but in heart. The steps no longer felt like a task, they became a rhythm, a quiet music. And the silence between them, that was the note that held it all together. From that day forward, Haku still walked, but differently. Not searching, not pushing, just listening. Moral of the story: stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the presence of awareness within movement. Between every sound, every breath, every step there is silence. And in that silence lives the peace we are looking for. We only need to stop long enough to hear it. The next story is called When No One Lit the Incense. This story speaks to the quiet power of intention, the difference between ritual and presence, and how the essence of peace is not in what we do, but in how we are. It reminds us that without mindfulness, even sacred actions can become empty, but with awareness, even silence becomes an offering. Every morning at dawn, the monks of the East Valley Temple gathered to begin their day with a simple ritual. One stick of incense would be lit and placed before the altar. As its soft smoke curled upward, the bell would ring and the temple would fall into stillness for morning meditation. It was always the same. The scent of sandalwood, the quiet breath of fire meeting wood, the smoke, like a thread, connecting the earth to the sky. One morning, as the sky turned from grey to gold, the monks assembled as usual. They sat in rows, straight-backed and silent. The bell rang. The air grew still, but the incense remained unlit. No one noticed at first. The ritual had become so familiar, so automatic, that their minds followed habit, not presence. The smoke was expected, assumed, but as the minutes passed, the subtle scent that usually warmed the room never came. The altar remained cold. A young monk named Riku finally opened his eyes. He looked to the altar and then around the room. The incense stick stood in place, untouched. His heart beat louder in the quiet. He turned to the head monk and whispered, "Master." No one lit the incense. The head monk did not open his eyes. He simply said, "Then that is today's teaching." After the session ended, the master stood before the altar and spoke to them all. "We did everything except see. We bowed, we sat, but we did not arrive. This stick of incense waited, as the moment always does, for us to truly be here." The monks bowed their heads, not in shame, but in understanding. That morning, the unlit incense had said more than the smoke ever could. Moral of the story: peace is not found in ritual alone. It lives in attention, in presence, in the quiet act of truly showing up. When we stop moving through life on autopilot, even a single stick of incense or its absence can awaken us. The next story is called The Sand Garden That Disappeared Overnight. This story speaks to impermanence, the letting go of control, and the deep peace found in accepting change. It teaches that beauty does not need to last to be meaningful, and that trying to hold on to what must pass only creates suffering. True calm arises when we create, give thanks, and release. In a quiet temple nestled at the edge of a small fishing village, there was a Zen monk named Ritsu, who spent each morning tending to the temple's sand garden. With a wooden rake and steady hands, he shaped the sand into flowing patterns that looked like water moving around stones. Villagers often came just to watch the garden in silence, finding peace in the gentle curves and the care with which Ritsu shaped them. Each day, Ritsu created something new: circles, ripples, waves, all drawn with deep focus and no attachment. But one afternoon, after weeks of especially calm weather, Ritsu made a garden so delicate and beautiful that even he felt stillness settle deeper in his chest. The monks praised it. Visitors bowed to it. The abbot himself paused, saying, "This one feels like the breath of the sea." That night, a sudden storm came, Fierce winds whipped through the temple grounds. Rain fell sideways. In the morning, Ritsu stepped outside and saw it. The garden had vanished. The sand was scattered, the lines erased, the stones buried. Nothing remained of the careful creation. It looked like an empty patch of earth. A young monk nearby gasped, "After all your work." But Ritsu only smiled, lifted his rake, and said, "Then we begin again." The monk blinked, confused. "You're not sad?" Ritsu knelt in the wet sand. "I do not shape the garden to make it last. I shape it to be present while it lives. The storm is not my enemy. It is part of the pattern too." And with that, he began to rake new, line-simple ones, shaped by the memory of rain. Moral of the story: peace does not come from preserving what we love. It comes from loving fully, then letting go. Like the sand garden, everything beautiful is temporary. But if we are present with it while it lives, its disappearance does not take our peace, it deepens it. The next story is called Shoji Door, Opened by the Wind. This story reveals the truth about control, surrender, and the soft openings life gives us when we stop forcing and simply allow. It teaches that peace is often found not by doing, but by not doing, by letting things move on their own, and trusting the quiet intelligence of the moment. In a small temple near the sea, where gulls cried in the morning and pine needles fell like slow rain, lived an old Zen nun named Ima. She had lived there for decades, tending the garden, boiling tea, and welcoming students who came with hearts full of questions and minds tangled with seeking. Her room was simple, just a low table, a mat, and a shoji door that faced the ocean. The paper panels fluttered gently with the sea breeze. It was said that she never closed that door completely. Students wondered why. One afternoon, a new student arrived, young, restless, eager for answers. "Master," he said, "I've studied many things. I've meditated for years. But I still feel like the door won't open. I don't know how to enter the calmness others speak of." Ima looked at him kindly, and instead of answering, she served tea. As they sat in silence, the wind stirred outside. A gentle gust moved across the room, and the shoji door, which had been nearly closed, slowly slid open, just a little. The ocean glimmered through the space it revealed. The student turned to look. Ima said softly, "Did you open the door?" He shook his head. "Did I?" "No." She nodded. "Then why did it open?" He paused, confused. "Because the wind?" Ima smiled. "Exactly. It opened when it was time. You see, not all doors respond to effort. Some respond only to stillness. You knock and nothing happens. Then one day, the wind opens it for you, and you realize the door was never locked." The student said nothing. His breath slowed. For the first time in days, his shoulders dropped, and his searching quieted. Moral of the story: not everything must be pushed open. Some doors yield when we stop grasping. Peace is not always achieved by striving, but by softening. When we trust the breeze, the moment, the silence, we may find that what we were looking for opens gently on its own. The next story is called A Whisper Heard Under the Bodhi Tree. This story speaks to inner guidance, quiet realization, and the voice of truth that speaks not in shouts, but in whispers. It reminds us that deep peace does not arrive with thunder or fireworks. It arises gently, in the soft space between thoughts, when the heart is finally still enough to listen. Long after the Buddha's passing, monks still gathered beneath the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, the place where he awakened. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to sit under its spreading branches, hoping that the stillness of that sacred place would stir something within them too. One such pilgrim was a young nun named Soma. She had read every sutra, memorized long chants, and practiced hours of meditation each day. Yet something still felt missing. Her mind was sharp, but her heart felt restless, like she was always on the edge of knowing, but never quite there. One dawn, she sat alone under the Bodhi tree before the crowds arrived. The sky was pale and silent. She closed her eyes, drew in a long breath, and whispered, "I've done everything I was told. Why does peace still feel so far away?" There was no reply. She sat longer. A leaf fluttered and fell nearby. A breeze passed through the branches. The tree creaked slightly as the wood shifted in the morning air. And then, just as she was about to rise, he heard something. It wasn't a voice, not in the way people usually hear voices. It was more like a knowing, a wordless whisper, not outside her, but within. It said simply, "Stop searching, you're already home." Soma opened her eyes slowly. The tree looked the same. The world hadn't changed, but something inside her had. She no longer felt the urge to chase peace like a goal far ahead. She began to understand that peace wasn't something to earn or deserve. It was what remained when everything else was finally quiet. The whisper had been waiting all along. She had only needed to stop asking and start listening. Moral of the story: peace doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, heard only when the mind grows still. The truth we seek is often already within, us waiting, quietly, under the tree of our own heart. The next story is called The Bamboo That Grew in a Day. This story speaks of unseen growth, quiet patience, and the mysterious timing of transformation. It reminds us that peace often comes not in constant motion, but in trusting the process even when nothing seems to be changing. What looks still may be silently preparing to bloom. In a narrow valley surrounded by green hills and running streams, a Zen temple stood near a grove of bamboo. The monks often meditated there in the early morning, listening to the rustle of leaves and the soft tapping of hollow stalks swaying in the wind. One monk named Haruki spent hours tending the bamboo garden. Every morning he watered the shoots, cleared fallen leaves, and whispered sutras under his breath. But after months of effort, he began to feel frustrated. Some of the shoots barely grew. They seemed stuck, still short and stubborn despite his care. "I give them water. I give them time. Why do they not grow?" he asked the abbot. The abbot smiled and said, "Sit with them tonight." That evening, Haruki stayed in the grove long after the others had gone. The moon rose high. The wind quieted. He sat in silence, back straight, breath slow. In the stillness of midnight, a soft cracking sound reached his ears. Then another. He turned his head and saw something impossible. One of the bamboo stalk zone that had seemed unchanged for weeks was rising. Slowly, steadily, it creaked upward, inch by inch, stretching as if called by the stars. By dawn, it had grown almost a full meter. The next morning, Haruki ran to the abbot, amazed. "It grew in the night, all at once." The abbot nodded. "No, it grew every day. You just couldn't see it. Bamboo takes years to deepen its roots before it rises. If it rose too soon, it would fall." Haruki stood in silence. His frustration melted into stillness. He looked back at the bamboo, not as something failing, but as something waiting, gathering strength in silence. Moral of the story: peace and growth often happen beneath the surface, in silence, without signs. Just because we cannot see change does not mean it is not unfolding. Trust the stillness. What looks quiet today may rise tomorrow stronger than you ever imagined. The next story is called The Scentless Lotus. This story teaches us about silent worth, quiet grace, and the gentle power of being. It reminds us that not all beauty is loud or praised, and that peace often blooms not through recognition, but through simply fulfilling one's nature. True calm is found when we stop comparing and begin to see the value in simply existing. In a temple garden known for its blooming lotuses, pilgrims came from far away to admire the flowers. Some blossoms were wide and bright, with colors so vivid they seemed to hum in the sunlight. Others gave off a fragrance so sweet that people paused just to breathe them in. Among all the praised lotuses, there was one that rarely drew attention. Its petals were pale, almost whitened. It carried no scent at all. The other flowers bloomed around it in grand colors and rich aromas. But the scentless lotus stood quietly at the edge of the pond, barely noticed. One morning, a novice monk named Rui was asked to tend to the garden. As he moved between the blossoms, he found himself drawn to the quiet lotus with no scent. He touched its petal. It was soft and cool, no different from the others. Yet no one had placed incense by it. No one stopped to admire it. "Why do you grow here?" Rui whispered to the flower. "If no one sees you, no one praises you." That evening, Rui asked the head monk, "Why does the scentless lotus remain? It gives no fragrance. It goes unnoticed. Why would nature make something that offers so little?" The monk smiled and said, "That lotus has no need to be praised. It does not bloom for attention. It blooms because blooming is its way. It asks for nothing. It offers what it is." Later that night, Rui sat beside the flower in silence. A soft breeze passed, and in that moment he understood. The scentless lotus was not lesser. It was simply quiet. And in its stillness, it gave him more peace than all the fragrant blossoms combined. Moral of the story: not all beauty announces itself. Some peace lives in the quiet things that ask for nothing. We do not need to prove our worth to be enough. Like the scentless lotus, we can simply bloom, and that is more than enough. The next story is called The Koan, written in steam. This story teaches us about impermanence, presence, and the fleeting nature of understanding. It reminds us that truth is not always something to grasp, but something to witness softly, in passing, like breath on glass. Peace comes not from holding on, but from seeing clearly even as things fade. High in the mountains, where the mornings were cold and the clouds sat low upon the rooftops, there was a small tea hut run by an old Zen hermit named Yuto. He spoke very little, but his tea was known to bring calm even to the most restless heart. Travelers often stopped at his door, not just for warmth, but in search of something they couldn't name. One winter morning, a young monk visited the hut. He had spent years studying koan's paradoxical riddles, meant to awaken the mind, but none had opened his heart. He sat across from Yuto, shivering and tired, and said, "Master, I have chased understanding in scrolls and silence, but everything slips away. I grasp, and it disappears." Yuto nodded slowly and poured the tea. As the steam rose from the cup, he leaned close to the wooden table and, with his finger, traced a single character into the surface fogged by steam. It was there, clear, perfect for only a breath, and then it vanished. The monk blinked. "What did it say?" Yuto smiled gently. "Did you see it?" "Yes, but it's gone." "That is the koan," Yuto whispered. The young monk sat still. At first, confusion, then sorrow, and then quiet acceptance. He understood. The answer wasn't something to keep, it was something to witness. The steam still rose. The tea still warmed his hands. And though the symbol had faded, its impression lingered not in the mind, but in the heart. Moral of the story: some truths appear only for a moment, like steam on a table or breath on glass. Trying to hold them makes them disappear. But if we simply see, without clinging, peace finds us. Understanding is not always in what stays, but in what we are willing to let pass. The next story is called One Candle for 10,000 Eyes. This story speaks of quiet generosity, unseen influence, and the light we carry even when we do not know who it touches. It teaches that peace often spreads not through grand gestures, but through small, steady acts of presence. One simple offering made with sincerity can illuminate far more than we imagine. In a humble village nestled between dark hills, the winters were long and the nights colder than the river stones. There was an old monk who lived at the edge of town in a tiny hut made of wood and mud. He had no students, no title, no great temple. What he had was a single candle thick, half burned, and made from the tallow of many winters past. Each evening, as dusk settled, the monk would place the candle at the edge of the path leading from the village to the mountains. He would light it quietly, bow once, then return to his hut without a word. No signs, no teachings, just a small flame flickering in the wind. At first, no one noticed, but over time, travelers walking that path in darkness began to speak of it. "There's a light at the foot of the trail," they'd say. "Just enough to guide your step." Some believed it was lit by the temple. Others thought it a kind act from a villager. No one knew the source. One night, a storm blew through the valley, and the wind was cruel. The candle didn't burn. A child returning home from the mountain slipped on the wet stones and scraped his knee. His father, angry and protective, stormed through the village the next day, shouting, "Who let the path go dark?" The old monk heard and said nothing. That evening, when the storm passed, he placed the candle again, lit it, bowed, walked away. A few days later, someone else left a candle beside his, then another. By the end of the month, 10 candles lit the path. By spring, there were too many to count. No one ever said who they were for. They just kept lighting them. Moral of the story: you may never know who your peace touches, but one quiet act done with care, done in truth, can light the way for thousands. You don't need to be seen to bring light. Sometimes a single flame is enough for 10,000 eyes. The next story is called Master Ensho's Invisible Robe. This story is about humility, true presence, and the difference between appearance and essence. It teaches that peace does not come from titles, symbols, or recognition, but from living truthfully without needing to be seen, praised, or known. What cannot be seen with the eyes is often what touches the heart most deeply. Master Ensho was once the abbot of a great temple, known across the region for his fierce clarity and unwavering discipline. He wore fine robe, simple, but respected, and followers bowed deeply at his presence. Yet one day, without a word, he stepped down from his role. He left the temple, gave away his robes, and disappeared into the countryside. Years passed. Stories spread of an old man sweeping temple steps at forgotten monasteries. He wore no monk's robe, just faded clothes and a wide straw hat. Some said it was Ensho, but no one could be sure. He never spoke his name. He simply arrived, swept the leaves, and sat in silence under the trees. One autumn afternoon, a young novice at a small hilltop temple noticed the man sitting near the gate, gently brushing leaves into a neat pile. "Elder," the novice said, "you act like a monk, but you wear no robes." The man looked up, smiling softly. The robe was only a shadow. The vow was never stitched into cloth. "But how will anyone know who you are?" the novice asked. "They don't need to," he replied. "If I am kind, that is my teaching. If I am silent, that is my robe. If I leave no name behind, I leave no dust." The novice stood very still. He had spent weeks memorizing chants, perfecting bows, trying to look like a monk. But now he felt something deeper than any lesson he had heard, a kind of warmth, quiet and vast, coming not from robes or rank, but from a presence that asked for nothing. That night, the old man vanished, leaving behind nothing but the swept path and a folded leaf. Moral of the story: peace is not worn on the outside. True practice needs no badge, no praise. The invisible robe is made of actions, presence, and humility. When we no longer need to be seen as wise, we begin to truly live wisdom. The next story is called The Bowl That Refused Alms. This story teaches about purity of intention, silent discernment, and the quiet strength of choosing what aligns with truth. It reminds us that peace is not just acceptance, it is also knowing when to quietly say no. Sometimes, stillness protects us not through walls, but through gentle refusal. In a remote forest temple far from the crowded cities, there lived a wandering monk named Akan. He carried with him only one thing, a simple wooden alms bowl passed down from his teacher. It was worn smooth from years of use, polished not by oil, but by the touch of time and weather. Each morning, Akan would walk to nearby villages, holding out his bowl with both hands. He never asked for anything. He only offered the space, the openness to receive. And from that emptiness, food would appear, roots, warm broth, fruit. But always, he bowed with gratitude, no matter how little or how much was given. One morning, in a wealthy village where gold was more common than humility, a merchant saw Akan and called him over. "Monk," the man said with a smile too wide, "you walk with nothing, yet you carry yourself like a king. Here, take this." He dropped a heavy coin into the bowl, loud, flashy, not offered with kindness, but with arrogance. "That should feed you for days." Akan looked down, but the bowl did something strange. It tilted slightly, and the coin rolled out, falling to the dirt with a quiet thud. The merchant laughed, thinking it an accident, and placed it in again. Once more, the bowl tipped. The coin fell. The villagers stopped. They watched. Akan said nothing. The merchant frowned and tried again. A third time, the bowl refused. No one could explain it. Finally, the monk bowed deeply, not to the coin, but to the man, and turned to walk away, leaving the bowl light and empty, but at peace. Later, a small child ran up and placed a steamed bun in the bowl with both hands, eyes wide with reverence. The bowl stayed still. The monk bowed once more, this time with a quiet smile. Moral of the story: not everything offered is meant to be received. True peace knows the difference. A generous heart does not crave attention, and a quiet soul does not feed on pride. Even a bowl can tell the difference between what nourishes and what only weighs us down. The next story is called When the Moon Rose During Midbow. This story reflects the power of surrender, reverence, and the unexpected beauty found in moments of stillness. It teaches that peace often enters not when we finish something, but while we are in the middle of it, when the heart is open, the ego quiet, and the mind gently bowed to something greater than itself. In a quiet Zen temple near a lake that mirrored the sky, evening bows were part of the daily rhythm. As the sun set, the monks would gather in the main hall, kneel slowly, and offer a full, mindful bow to the altar. No words, no music, just silence and breath folding toward the earth. One evening in early autumn, a young monk named Ray stood in line among his brothers. The air was crisp, the hall dim, lit only by the last gold light of day. Ray had been struggling with restlessnesses, thoughts full of questions, worries, plans. He longed for peace, but felt disconnected, uncertain. As the bell rang, each monk began to bow. Ray followed, lowering his body, his hands meeting the floor. And just as he reached the deepest point of his bow forehead near the mat, arms outstretched, the light in the room suddenly changed. A soft silver glow spread across the walls. The air itself seemed to shimmer. The full moon had risen, its reflection pouring through the high window and bathing the hall in a quiet, celestial light. Ray did not move. He remained in his bow, breath caught not in fear, but awe. In that suspended moment, there was no him, no searching, no past or future. Only stillness, only the moon. Only now, when he finally rose, tears were quietly resting in his eyes. No one spoke, but something had shifted. Later, he asked the old master, "Why did the moon appear in that moment?" The master replied, "Because your heart was open wide enough to see it." Moral of the story: peace does not always arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it finds us mid-breath, mid-step, mid-bow. When the self drops away, even for a moment, the beauty of the world steps in. We do not reach peace by chasing light, but by bowing fully into the present. The next story is called The Rooster Who Recited Sutra. This story teaches the unexpected nature of wisdom and how peace arises when we release judgment about where truth should come from. It reminds us that the Dharma is not limited to human voices or perfect settings. It sings through every part of life, even in places we least expect. At a modest temple on the edge of the countryside, the monks rose each day before sunrise to chant the morning sutras. Their voices echoed gently across the courtyard, soft and steady like waves in the mist. It was a peaceful ritual, never rushed, never forced. One spring, a farmer nearby gifted the temple a rooster white-feathered, proud and loud. He had been disrupting the farmer's sleep with his cries at odd hours, so the monks agreed to take him in. They built him a small coop near the meditation hall. But the rooster did not crow only at dawn. He called out during chanting, during meditation, during stillness. His voice cut sharply through the air, high and clear, loud enough to shake the birds from the trees. Some monks grew irritated. Others tried to move their cushions farther away. "Why must he interrupt our practice?" one monk asked the abbot. "We cannot find peace with that noise." The abbot said nothing at first. The next morning, during the pre-dawn chant, he stood quietly at the front of the hall. As the monks began their recitation, the rooster let out a loud, piercing cry. The abbot raised his hand and all chanting stopped. "Listen," he said, "and hear his sutra." The monks fell silent. The rooster crowed again, then again. The sound echoed through the valley roar, pure, untrained. Yet beneath its sharpness was rhythm, presence, power. It did not ask to be heard. It simply was. The abbot spoke gently. "He does not know the words, but he announces the morning with full heart. That is more than most can say." From that day on, the monks began their chanting only after the rooster's first call, not as a nuisance, but as the beginning bell. Moral of the story: wisdom wears many faces. Peace is not found in perfect silence, but in how we listen. The world is full of teachings, not always in sacred voices, but often in honest ones. Even a rooster, loud and untrained, can speak the Dharma if we let him. The next story is called A Spoonful of Silence. This story teaches us about the nourishment of stillness, the depth found in simplicity, and how true peace often enters when we stop filling every space. It reminds us that not all hunger is for foodsome, is for quiet, for presence, for the gentle pause that brings the heart back to itself. In a humble Zen kitchen nestled behind the main hall of a forest temple, an elderly nun named Kyoko prepared the morning rice porridge. She moved without noise, her steps soft, her hands gentle. The bowls she touched never clinked. The ladle in her hand was like an extension of her breath. Young novices often volunteered to help her, thinking they'd learn special recipes or secrets of temple cooking. But Kyoko taught something deeper. One morning, a novice named Hana joined her. Eager and talkative, Hana chopped vegetables quickly and asked many questions about Zen, about enlightenment, about how to find calm. Kyoko said little. She only nodded and stirred the pot. When the porridge was ready, she set out 2 bowls and began to serve. She filled Hana's first, then paused before filling her own. But instead of scooping porridge, Kyoko lifted the ladle gently and lowered it empty into her bowl. She did it slowly, as if serving something invisible. 1, 2, 3 spoonfuls of nothing. Then she sat down, hands in her lap, eyes closed. Hana stared, confused. "You forgot your food," she said. Kyoko opened her eyes and smiled. "No," she replied. "Today I am feeding silence." Hana blinked. "But how can you eat nothing?" "You asked how to find calm," Kyoko said. "Here it is, a spoonful of silence. Most people fill every bowl, every moment, every thought, but sometimes peace comes when we leave space." They sat together, one eating, one not, and in that shared quiet, something shifted in Hana. The steam from the porridge rose gently between them. No more questions came. Just the warmth of the bowl in her hands and the soft company of silence. Moral of the story: stillness is not empty, it is full of life. When we stop filling every space with words, noise, or need, we begin to taste peace. A spoonful of silence may nourish more than a full bowl ever could. The next story is called The Inkstone That Drew a Circle. This story teaches the beauty of completion without conclusion, and the peace that arises when we express truth simply, without decoration. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful teachings are drawn in a single, silent gestural circle that speaks of everything and nothing. In a small hillside temple known for its calligraphy, the monks practiced writing each morning with quiet focus. Rows of rice paper, brushes, and black ink were arranged with care. They believed that to hold a brush was to hold the mind itself. Shaky strokes revealed a shaky heart. Among them was an elder monk named Ryo, who no longer spoke much, but whose scrolls were treasured across the region. His characters flowed like water, balanced, bold, and perfectly placed. Yet one day, without explanation, Ryo stopped writing words altogether. Instead, he would sit before a fresh scroll, dip his brush into the inkstone, and without hesitation draw a single circle. No flourish, no symbols, just one complete, unbroken loop of ink. The younger monks whispered about it. "He draws the same thing every day. What does it mean? Has he forgotten the teachings?" One day, a student approached him and asked, "Master Ryo, why no words? Why only a circle?" Ryo looked at the ink drying on his most recent scroll and said, "When the bowl is full, it needs no label. When the bell is struck, it does not explain itself. This," he gestured to the circle, "is everything I have learned." The student frowned. "But it has no beginning, no ending." "Exactly," Ryo said softly. "Just like breath, just like the path, just like this moment." The next day, the student tried drawing a circle himself. His hand trembled. The line wavered. His mind filled with doubt. That's when he understood. The brush only follows the mind. And a true circle is not drawn with skill, it is drawn with presence. Moral of the story: some truths cannot be spoken. Some peace cannot be taught. It can only be felt complete and quiet, like a circle drawn with a steady hand and an empty mind. The more we try to explain, the further we drift. But when we simply return to the center, we find we've never left. The next story is called A Monk Slept Inside the Bell. This story reveals the strange ways peace can find us when we stop struggling to find it. It teaches that sometimes the mind becomes quiet, not through effort, but through surrender, accident, and mystery. Even the heaviest burdens, like a giant bell, can hold silence deep enough to awaken the soul. There was once a young monk named Isho who could not stop thinking. No matter how long he meditated, how deeply he breathed, his mind ran like a wild horse. He chased silence the way others chase gold, desperately, endlessly. The more he tried, the further it seemed to slip away. One summer evening, after a long day of chores, Isho wandered into the bell tower. The great bronze temple bell stood tall and still, untouched since the morning chant. Its hollow body glowed softly in the twilight, and its cool, empty shape called to him like a cave. He stepped inside just for a moment to rest. The air inside was still and dim. The thick bronze walls swallowed sound. No wind, no footsteps, no voices, only the faint smell of dust and old metal. Isho sat down. Then, surprisingly, he lay down. The stone floor was hard, but his body softened. For the first time in months, his thoughts began to slow, not because he was trying to silence them, but because there was nothing left to resist. Just breath, just stillness, just the bell. He fell asleep. The next morning, the bell ringer came, not knowing Isho was inside. He raised the wooden beam and struck the bell. A deep, earth-shaking tone echoed through the valley, full and low, vibrating through trees, roofs, and birdsong. Isho woke inside the sound, not startled, not afraid. He opened his eyes and smiled, wide and quiet. He felt as though he had been struck, not with fear, but with awakening. Inside the sound, he had disappeared, and in disappearing, he had found peace. He emerged from the bell, calm, grounded, new. Moral of the story: sometimes we find peace not by chasing it, but by stopping. When we let go of the struggle, even in exhaustion or silence, we become empty enough to be filled. And in that emptiness, even the loudest sound can become a doorway to stillness. The next story is called When No One Rang the Wake-Up Gong. This story teaches about self-awareness, inner discipline, and the deep calm that arises when we stop relying on outer noise to guide our inner world. It reminds us that true awakening is not triggered by bells or rules, but by the quiet readiness within. Peace doesn't come from being pushed, it comes when we choose to rise. At a monastery nestled in the fog-covered hills, life moved to the sound of the bell. The gong rang at dawn to wake the monks, again at noon for meals, and once more at dusk for evening chants. It marked time, guided movement, and shaped silence. Among the many rituals, the morning gong was most sacred. At exactly 5 o'clock, the sound of the mallet striking metal echoed across the valley like a voice calling from the sky. Monks rose at once, no matter the season, no matter the cold. To miss the bell was to miss the first breath of the day. One winter morning, snow fell heavy through the night, muffling all sound. At dawn, the temple remained still. The gong, for the first time in many years, did not ring. Inside their quarters, the monks stirred in their beds. Some sat up, waiting. Others looked out at the snow and wondered. No bell, no sound. Was it still night? Was something wrong? But one monk, a young man named Taku, rose anyway. Without checking the time, without waiting for permission, he lit a small lamp, folded his blanket, and walked to the meditation hall. He bowed to the cushion and sat. One by one, other monks appeared, some groggy, some confused, all quiet. Soon, the room was full, and still, the gong had not sounded. When the abbot arrived, he smiled, bowing deeply to them all. "Today," he said softly, "you did not awaken because a bell told you. You awakened because you were ready." The snow continued to fall. Outside, it was silent. Inside, it was still. Moral of the story: peace is not always announced. Awakening does not always come with sound. Sometimes the world is quiet, and no one calls your name. In those moments, the question is, will you rise anyway? The true gong is within you, and it rings when the heart is ready. The next story is called Two Pebbles, the Sea of Mind. This story explores the restless nature of thought, the search for clarity, and the quiet depth that lives beneath the surface of our minds. It teaches that true peace is not found in solving every thought, but in watching them come and go, like ripples on water without diving into every wave. On a windswept shore where the temple met the sea, Master Daisen often walked at dawn. The tide rolled in slowly, and the ocean breathed like a sleeping giant. He would stop at the same flat stone each morning and watch the water rise, fall, rise again. One morning, a novice named Minato followed. He had been struggling with overthinking too many thoughts, too many choices. "Master," he said, "my mind is full of noise. I chase one thought and another appears. I try to quiet them, but they keep crashing like waves." Daisen said nothing. He reached down and picked up two small pebbles, smooth and round. He placed one in Minato's hand and kept the other for himself. "Watch," Daisen said. He tossed his pebble into the sea. A soft plop. Ripples spread, then faded. Minato did the same. Another circle on the surface. Then silence. Daisen turned to him. "The sea is your mind. Each pebble is a thought. When you throw it, the water responds, but only for a moment. Then it returns to stillness. Do you see?" Minato nodded slowly. "But the thoughts keep coming." Daisen smiled gently. "Yes, pebbles will fall. Some are thrown by you, some by the world. But the sea does not try to catch them. It lets them land. It lets them go." They stood in silence. The wind moved through the reeds. The water shimmered with sky. That morning, Minato didn't try to stop his thoughts. He watched them arrive, watched them pass. For the first time, he felt like the Shano, the pebble. Moral of the story: your thoughts are not the problem. Chasing them is. Peace begins when you stop diving after every ripple and begin to rest in the depth beneath. Like the sea, your mind is vast. Let the pebbles fall. Let the surface move. Stillness is always waiting just below. The next story is called The Cicada Who Meditated. This story speaks of stillness in the midst of noise and the unexpected wisdom found in the rhythms of nature. It teaches that peace does not require silence around us, only silence within us. Even in a world that hums and rattles and sings loudly, the mind can rest, quietly and completely. In a quiet clearing near the edge of the forest, the monks of a small temple gathered each afternoon for outdoor zazen. They sat in neat rows beneath a canopy of trees, letting the sunlight warm their robes and the wind stir their sleeves. But one summer, the cicadas came early. Their high, buzzing song filled the air from dawn to dusk. It was constant, piercing, sharp, impossible to ignore. Some monks complained. Some wore cotton in their ears. Others avoided the clearing altogether. "This noise is unbearable," one said. "How can we meditate through that?" The abbot, an old monk with quiet eyes and a slower breath than most, simply smiled. "Then go sit with the cicada." A young monk named Ren decided to try. The next day, instead of joining the others, he sat alone near a tree where a cicada clung to the bark. It buzzed loudly, just inches from his face. At first, Ren resisted. His mind fidgeted, his breath shortened, but he stayed. He began to notice the pattern of the sound, not chaos, but rhythm, not irritation, but effort. The cicada's song wasn't senseless, it was its whole being. It did not sing to disturb. It sang because that was what it had been born to do. Ren softened. He stopped trying to push the sound away. Instead, he breathed with it, sat with it, became part of it. He stayed there for hours. When he returned to the temple, the other monks asked, "Was it quiet there?" "No," Ren said, "but I was." From then on, he sat in the clearing every day, never far from the cicadas, never bothered by their song. Moral of the story: the world will never be perfectly quiet, but your mind can be. Peace doesn't wait for silence. It grows through attention, presence, and surrender. Even a cicada, loud and relentless, becomes a teacher when we stop resisting and start listening. The next story is called Master Gakuen's Feather Brush. This story speaks to the quiet strength of gentleness, the discipline of care, and the art of expressing peace through even the smallest act. It reminds us that true stillness is not rigid or hard, but soft, precise, and full of attention. Peace doesn't have to be loud, it can be as light as a single brushstroke. Master Gakuen was a calligrapher unlike any other. His scrolls were simple, his strokes delicate, yet people said his brush carried the weight of silence. It was not power they felt when they saw his writing, it was peace. But what puzzled everyone most was his tool. While most monks used sturdy brushes made from horsehair or badger, Gakuen used a brush made from bird feather slite, nearly translucent, so fragile it bent under its own weight. One day, a student named Yori asked him, "Master, why do you use a brush that is so weak? Wouldn't a stronger one make your lines more bold?" Gakuen looked up from his scroll and smiled. "Strength is not always in boldness," he said. "This brush cannot force a line. It listens to my hand. It obeys the ink. It whispers." He dipped the feather into the inkstone, then paused before touching the paper. His breath slowed, his body stilled. With the softest movement, he drew one character: mu emptiness, nothingness. The ink shimmered on the paper, graceful, barely touching the surface, yet deeply present. Yori watched in awe. "But what if your hand shakes? What if you press too hard?" "Then the brush breaks," Gakuen said, "and the stroke loses its truth. It teaches me to move only with what is needed, nothing more." Later that evening, Yori sat alone with his own brush. He noticed how often he gripped it too tightly, how he pushed to be perfect, how he rushed. But when he loosened his hand even slightly, the ink began to flow with ease. Not just on the paper, but within him. Moral of the story: peace is not found in force, but in gentle precision. When we stop trying to control and start moving with care, even fragile tools create powerful truths. A quiet touch, a light breath, a soft stroke, these are the marks of stillness. The next story is called The Statue That Breathed. This story teaches the mystery of perception, the depth of presence, and how stillness itself can feel alive when we are fully awake. It reminds us that peace is not always found in action, or answer-sit is felt in moments when time disappears, and the line between self and the world quietly dissolves. At the heart of a cold stone temple stood a statue of the Buddha, carved from a single block of granite. It sat cross-legged, hands in the mudra of compassion, eyes closed in eternal calm. It had not moved in hundreds of years. Wind and rain had weathered its surface. Dust had softened its edges, but its presence filled the entire room, as if it was still watching, still listening. Every morning, a novice named Cain swept the temple floor. He did so carefully, always ending his work in front of the statue. Some days he would sit before it and wonder, how can something so still feel more alive than I do? One winter morning, as snow fell gently outside, Cain arrived before sunrise. The temple was colder than usual, and he wrapped his robe tighter as he lit a single candle. The flame flickered. The shadows moved. He bowed before the statue, then paused. Something felt different. He sat down, folded his legs, and faced it in silence. At first, he watched the statue, but then he began to feel it, not in his eyes, but in his chest. Not as a thought, but as a breath. It was so subtle, he doubted it at first, a gentle rising, a falling, a rhythm, as if the stone itself was breathing. Cain closed his eyes. He matched his breath to what he felt, not seen, not proven, but deeply real. In that stillness, something shifted. He could no longer tell where he ended and the statue began. His thoughts dropped away. There was no him, no it, only breath, stillness, presence. When the morning bell rang, Cain opened his eyes. The statue hadn't moved, it hadn't changed, but he had. Moral of the story: stillness is not lifeless. It is alive with presence. When we stop searching for movement and begin to feel what is already here, we discover that even the unmoving can awaken us. Peace is not always in motion. It often breathes in silence, waiting to be felt. The next story is called "The Rain Never Touched the Master's Hat." This story speaks of deep inner calm, the protection of presence, and the quiet strength that comes from being truly grounded. It reminds us that peace is not about escaping the storms of life, but walking through them so steadily, so centered, that they pass around us like clouds around a mountain. Master Jinto was known in his province not for his teachings, but for the way he walked in the rain. Whenever storms came, soft drizzle or loud thunder, he would go out in his wide straw hat and thin robe, walking the paths between villages with no urgency and no fear. People watched from windows and whispered, "Look, he's walking again, and he never gets wet." It was true. Somehow, even in heavy rain, the drops never seemed to touch him. His robe stayed dry, his face unworried. It became a quiet legend. The rain never touched the master's hat. One young monk, Rio, curious and skeptical, asked to walk with him. "Master, how can it be? Everyone is soaked, but you are dry. Is it a trick of the wind? A secret path?" Jinto only smiled and handed Rio an extra hat. They walked. The rain began to fall, soft and steady, enough to dampen the leaves, the path, the sky. Rio watched carefully. His own shoulders were wet within moments, but Jinto moved as if inside a still bubble. Not fast, not slow. Each step was quiet, placed, aware. He didn't fight the rain. He didn't brace against it. He moved with it, like part of it. Back at the temple, soaked and puzzled, Rio asked again, "How did it not touch you?" Jinto removed his hat and placed it on the floor, still dry beneath. "It's not about avoiding the rain," he said. "It's about not meeting it with tension. Most people flinch, rush, complain, resist. I just walk. The rain falls where it may." Rio was silent. He realized his wetness had come not only from rain, but from the storm in his own mind. Moral of the story: peace does not come from avoiding life's storms. It comes from how we meet them. When we walk gently, without resistance, even the rain falls more softly. Sometimes it never touches us, not because it isn't there, but because we no longer fight it. The next story is called "The Waking Dream of the Gatekeeper." This story explores the veil between illusion and awareness, and how clinging to the roles we play can keep us from waking up. It reminds us that peace is not found by guarding the world, but by stepping through the gate we've unknowingly built around ourselves. Sometimes, to awaken is not to do more, but to stop pretending we are still asleep. At the far edge of a mountaintop temple, where mist curled like smoke and the wind spoke in long breaths, there was a quiet wooden gate. It had stood there for centuries, though few passed through it anymore. And yet, every morning and every night, a single monk stood by it, motionless, watchful. His name was Arata, the gatekeeper. No one had asked him to take on the role. He had simply begun standing there years ago, after once dreaming that the temple would be overtaken by wild spirits if left unguarded. Since then, he had watched the gate without fail. He never missed a sunrise, never missed a shadow. While others chanted and worked and meditated, Arata stood firm, keeping watch over something that never came. One evening, an elder monk approached him with a soft smile. "You've stood at this gate longer than the birds have nested in the trees," the elder said. "What are you guarding?" Arata blinked, unsure. "I'm protecting the temple from what lies beyond." "And what lies beyond?" Arata looked past the gate. There was only fog, trees, quiet wind. "I don't know," he whispered. The elder bowed and said, "Then come sit. If something comes, we will meet it together." but Arata shook his head. "If I leave the gate, what if something enters?" The elder stepped forward and gently took Arata's hand. "Then let it enter. Let it pass. What you are guarding is not the temple. It's the dream you had long ago. Wake up." That night, Arata sat for the first time in years. The wind felt different now, no longer something to resist. As the sun rose the next morning, he stood by the gate once more, but only to watch the light move through it. And then he stepped through. Moral of the story: peace cannot come while we stand guard over illusions. We often protect fears we no longer need, roles we no longer are. When we let go of the dreams that bind us, we do not lose purpose, we awaken from it. And on the other side of that gate, we find we were always free. The next story is called Autumn Wind Through Hollow Bones. This story speaks of impermanence, surrender, and the quiet beauty of emptiness. It teaches that true peace often comes not from what we hold, but from what we've let go of. When we become hollow, not empty in despair, but open in spirit, life moves through us without resistance, like the wind through bare branches. There was once a monk named Koji who had grown old in the mountains. His body, once strong, had grown thin and light. His hands were bony, his steps slow. Some of the younger monks spoke of him with pity. "He has given everything away," they said. "He owns nothing. He teaches little. He barely speaks. He is like an old flute with no music left." But Koji smiled often, and the forest loved him. Birds landed near him. The wind moved differently when he walked by softly, as if recognizing its own. One evening, during early autumn, a young monk named Haru followed Koji into the forest. The wind had picked up, and orange leaves swirled like fire across the path. Haru wanted to ask about enlightenment, about purpose, about what to become. But as they walked, he said nothing. Finally, the old monk stopped near a bare maple tree. Its leaves were almost gone, its limbs thin and exposed. Koji reached out his hand and let the wind move through his fingers. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "The wind?" Haru replied. "No," Koji whispered. "The space it passes through." Haru looked down at Koji's hand, just skin and bone. No, and suddenly he understood. Koji's strength wasn't in what he had kept, but in what he had released. No clutter, no noise, no ego. He had become like the tree bear, light and open enough to let the wind sing through him. They stood there a long time, saying nothing, as the wind passed gently through the trees and through them. Moral of the story: peace is not found in holding more, but in becoming less. When we let go of what we cling to, titles, fears, expectations, we become like hollow bones, not broken but open. And through that openness, life itself plays its quiet, perfect song. The next story is called Bowing to a Fallen Ginkgo Leaf. This story teaches the sacredness of small things, the reverence found in impermanence, and how peace arises when we bow not just to the great and eternal, but also to the fleeting and ordinary. It reminds us that every moment, if met with presence, is worthy of our full attention and quiet respect. In the courtyard of an old Zen temple stood a single ginkgo tree. Its trunk was wide, its branches long and patient. Every autumn the tree turned gold. Its leaves shimmered like coins in the morning light, and for just a few weeks the courtyard glowed as if touched by heaven. One morning, as the air grew colder and the ground began to gather yellow, a young monk named Nari passed beneath the tree on her way to morning chants. She moved quickly, eyes fixed ahead, thoughts already racing toward the tasks of the day. But as she stepped forward, a single leaf drifted down in front of her, slow, graceful, silent. It spun once in the air, then landed at her feet. Without thinking, Nari stopped. She stared at it, so small, so light. Yet something about the way it fell stirred something still inside her. She bowed instinctively, fully, not to a teacher, not to a statue, but to the leaf. Another monk walking nearby noticed and chuckled. "You're bowing to leaves now?" he asked. Nari didn't reply. She simply smiled and continued walking, her steps slower now, her breath deeper. That evening, the head monk asked the group during tea, "What have you bowed to today?" Some spoke of the Buddha, of ancestors, of noble teachings. When it was Nari's turn, she said softly, "A ginkgo leaf." The room grew quiet. The abbot nodded. "To bow to a falling leaf is no different than bowing to the universe," he said. "What you honor, you become still enough to see, and what you see, you begin to love." That night, the courtyard filled with golden leaves. And as the wind passed through, some monks began to bow not out of ritual, but out of deep and simple gratitude. Moral of the story: peace lives in the smallest things. A moment, a leaf, a breath. When we treat even the briefest beauty with reverence, the world softens, the heart opens. And in that bow, we find ourselves returned to what truly matters: presence, humility, and the quiet joy of being here. The next story is called The Hushed Thunder of Enlightenment. This story speaks of awakening not as a blinding flash or dramatic event, but as a quiet shift that shakes the heart from within. It teaches us that true enlightenment doesn't always arrive with noise or fireworks. Sometimes it comes like thunder muffled in the distances, oft, steady, undeniable. In a remote cliffside temple where clouds curled around the rocks like smoke, a monk named Shoin sat day after day in search of enlightenment. He had read the scriptures, memorized the words of the masters, and meditated until his legs went numb. Yet still, he felt far from awakening. "Why does it not come?" he asked the abbot one night as the storm clouds gathered outside. "I wait, I study, I breathe, but nothing happens." The abbot looked out the window, watching lightning ripple behind the mountains. "You are listening for thunder," he said, "but only with your ears." That night, Shoin could not sleep. The storm rolled in, low and slow. The wind pressed against the temple walls. He sat upright in his robes, determined to meditate through it, to listen more deeply. Then came the sound thunder, but not a crash. Not the kind that startles or splits the sky. It was low, almost like a growl deep beneath the earth, quiet but full. It did not shout, but it filled the space. Shoin's breath caught. Something inside him stilled. The thunder did not roar, it settled. In that moment, he understood. Enlightenment was not something to chase, not an explosion or a prize. It was something already present, already moving, just below the noise of wanting. He didn't rise, he didn't move, but something inside him, some heavy wall cracked. No light shot through, no words appeared, just a silence that echoed like thunder inside his chest. The storm passed, the sky cleared, and Shoin, still seated, no longer asked for anything. Moral of the story: awakening may not come with lightning. It may come like distant thunder, quiet, steady, and deep. We don't find it by forcing silence or begging for light. We find it when we stop reaching and begin to feel what's already moving beneath everything. The hush, the stillness, the truth that doesn't need to shout. The next story is called The Monk Who Laughed at Lightning. This story teaches about fear, surrender, and the fearless joy that can rise when we stop resisting the uncontrollable. It reminds us that peace is not the absence of storms, it is the deep knowing that we are not separate from them. In accepting impermanence, we find the freedom to laugh, even when the sky splits open. High in the mountains, in a temple with paper walls and creaking beams, lived a monk named Jori. He was known for his strange habit, laughed during thunderstorms. Whenever the skies darkened and the winds began to howl, Jori would head outside and sit beneath the eaves, watching the storm with a smile on his face. To the younger monks, This was confusing, maybe even foolish. Thunderstorms in the region were powerful. They rolled through the valley like lions, snapping trees, tearing at rooftops, cracking the sky with veins of fire. Most monks stayed inside, chanting sutras for protection. But not Jori. One night, a storm louder than any before began to rise. The temple rattled. Candles flickered out. Lightning lit the mountains like daylight, followed by thunder so fierce it shook the floor. Still, Jori walked out calmly and sat on the wooden deck. The wind pulled at his robe. Rain stung his face. A flash of lightning struck a tree nearby, and the thunder that followed came like the roar of 100 drums. And Jori laughed, not in defiance, not in madness, but in joy, pure and full. The next morning, a curious monk approached him. "Weren't you afraid?" he asked. The storm was terrifying. Jori looked at him gently and replied, "Fear only arises when you think you can separate yourself from the sky. I used to tremble too, until I realized lightning does not strike me personally. It just is. Why fear what doesn't aim at you, what never hated you, what doesn't even know your name?" The monk stood silent, unsure, and yet a little lighter. Moral of the story: peace is not found by avoiding storms. It's found by standing in the rain with an open heart. When we let go of the illusion of control and stop taking the thunder personally, we may find, even in the lightning, something beautiful enough to laugh with. The next story is called The Night Sky Inside a Rice Bowl. This story teaches us about wonder, gratitude, and the boundless beauty hidden in the most ordinary moments. It reminds us that peace isn't always found in temples, or teaching sits often waiting in the simple things we overlook. When the mind is quiet, even a bowl of rice can hold the stars. In a quiet village temple, mealtime was sacred. The monks ate in silence, one grain at a time, hands steady, eyes lowered. Every bowl was the same small wooden, worn smooth by years of use. One young monk, Toma, found this part of practice frustrating. "We eat the same food every day," he thought. "No variety, no excitement, just rice and pickles, rice and pickles." He longed for something more meaningful, some deeper experience that would open his mind, something beyond routine. One night, while washing dishes after the evening meal, he picked up a rice bowl to clean. The oil lamp nearby flickered low, and as he turned the bowl in the warm water, he paused. Inside the curved surface of the wet wood, the reflection of the night sky appeared: stars, soft clouds, the roundness of the moon, all trembling gently on the surface. For a moment, it looked like the whole universe had curled itself inside that small, simple bowl. Toma stood still, his breath slowed. The chatter in his mind faded. He held the bowl like something sacred, not because it had changed, but because he had finally looked. Later that evening, he went to the old cook and whispered, "I saw the night sky in my rice bowl." The cook smiled without turning around. "Then you're finally tasting the meal." From then on, Toma bowed a little deeper before each meal, not because the rice had changed, but because he had. He saw the warmth of the steam, the kindness of the hands that served it, and the quiet wonder in each bite. Moral of the story: peace lives in the ordinary. When the mind is still and the heart open, even a rice bowl can reflect the stars. We don't need more, we need to see more clearly. The universe is always here, whispering through the simple things, waiting for us to notice. The next story is called Zen Master Who Spoke to Fireflies. This story teaches about wonder, patience, and the gentle conversation between silence and light. It reminds us that peace is not only found in stillness, but in the small, fleeting moments that glow briefly, then vanish. When we stop chasing meaning and simply watch, life begins to speak. There was once a Zen master named Isan who lived alone in a forest temple surrounded by tall grasses, clear streams, and silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Every summer night, the fireflies would come, thousands of tiny lights, blinking in the darkness, like stars that had dropped down to dance among the trees. The villagers said Isan spoke to them. "He sits there for hours," they whispered. "He talks to the fireflies, and they listen." Curious, a young monk named Daigo asked to visit him. The master agreed, but gave no instructions, no koans, no teachings. That evening, they sat outside as the sky turned from gold to grey to black. Soon the fireflies commune, then 5, then hundreds. The trees shimmered with quiet light. Isan didn't speak. He only raised his hand gently, as if greeting an old friend. A firefly landed on his palm, its light blinking slow and soft. Daigo whispered, "What do you say to them?" Isan smiled without turning. "Nothing. I just listen." "To what?" Daigo asked. "To the way they live," the master replied. "They do not speak, but they show. They do not stay, but they return. They carry light, but not for praise. They are born of the dusk and disappear before morning. Isn't that what we are too?" Daigo felt a stillness settle in his chest. He watched one firefly blinken, off, on again, and in that simple rhythm, he saw something tender. No lesson, no explanation. Just beauty, offered and gone. That night, neither of them said another word. They simply sat with the flickering silence, two humans beneath a sky of living stars. Moral of the story: peace doesn't always shout or explain. Sometimes it glows softly and disappears. When we stop needing every moment to mean something, we begin to feel the quiet truth of things. Like fireflies, the most fleeting lights can leave the deepest calm if we're still enough to see them. The next story is called The Gate Without Hinges. This story explores the nature of freedom, illusion, and the silent walls we build within ourselves. It teaches us that many of the barriers we face are not made of stone or wood, but of thought, expectation, and fear. Peace comes not by pushing through, but by realizing the gate was never locked. At the edge of a remote Zen monastery stood a peculiar structure, a tall wooden gate, perfectly crafted, but with no hinges, no handle, and no doors. It stood alone, neither opening nor closing, just a frame in the wind. Travelers would stop and stare, puzzled. "How do you go through it?" they'd ask. An old monk named Seta tended the path nearby. He never explained the gate to anyone. He simply swept the fallen leaves around it each morning, pausing once in a while to bow toward it, as if bowing to nothing at all. One day, a frustrated young pilgrim approached Seta. "I've been walking in circles," he said. "I came here seeking clarity, and all I find is this strange gate that leads nowhere. What is the meaning of it?" Seta smiled, leaned on his broom, and pointed. "Then go through." "But there's no way in," the pilgrim said. "There's no door." "Exactly," Seta replied. "So why are you waiting for one?" The pilgrim stepped closer. He looked again. The gate hadn't moved, hadn't changed, but something inside him softened. He realized he had been waiting for something to open, for permission, for a signal to continue. So he stepped through the empty space between the posts. Nothing happened, and yet everything did. From the other side, the wind felt different, clearer somehow, not because he had crossed a real threshold, but because he had stopped hesitating. Later, he would say that was the moment things began to fall away, his doubts, his tension, his constant search for the right way in. He realized the path was always open. He had simply never walked forward. Moral of the story: the greatest obstacles are often imagined. We wait for the door to open, never seeing the space already before us. Peace begins when we stop searching for an entrance and begin to trust that we were never truly outside. The gate without hinges is the gate within. The next story is called The Dog Who Circled the Dharma Hall. This story teaches about restlessness, searching, and the quiet truth that sometimes what we are chasing is already here. It reminds us that peace does not come from circling the teachings, but from sitting down inside them. Often, the answers we seek are waiting for us to stop moving. At a respected Zen monastery, nestled between silent hills, there lived a stray dog who had wandered in years ago. The monks never named him, but they fed him scraps, let him sleep by the gate, and welcomed his quiet company. He never barked, never begged. But each day, just before evening meditation, the dog would do something strange. He would walk in wide, patient circles around the Dharma hall, always counterclockwise. Always, 3 times. Then he'd lie down by the door, just outside. No one knew why. New monks found it amusing. Visitors whispered that perhaps the dog was a reincarnated monk stuck between teachings. Others believed it was simply habit. But the dog never entered the hall, not once. He walked the edge of the sacred space, then settled down, tail still, eyes soft. One day, a student asked the abbot, "Why doesn't the dog come inside? Does he not belong here?" The abbot looked out at the animal resting in the fading sun and said, "He is practicing in his own way, but perhaps, like many of us, he's still circling what he already carries within." That evening, during meditation, the students sat quietly, their breath slow and steady. But outside, the dog didn't circle. He simply walked to the entrance, paused, and stepped inside for the first time. He lay at the back of the room, behind the last row of cushions, and slept. No one stirred. The next morning, when the monks opened the hall, the dog was gone. Some said he left. Others said he had finished what he came to learn. Moral of the story: we often walk in circles around the truth, believing it lies just beyond reach. But peace doesn't wait at the edge, it lives quietly in the center, ready for us when we finally stop moving. Sometimes, the wisest step is the one that leads us nowhere except inward. The next story is called Shoes Left at the Edge of a Dream. This story speaks of letting go, of returning home, and the gentle awakening that happens when we step out of illusion and into presence. It reminds us that peace doesn't always come with answers, but with quiet acceptance that we don't need to carry the dream to find what's real. Sometimes we find it by taking off our shoes and simply standing where we are. In a temple surrounded by morning mist and the scent of pine, there lived a monk named Ren. He was known for his vivid visions filled with colors, voices, and symbols that seemed to offer glimpses of truth. He wrote them down, studied them, and sought meaning in every image. The monks called him the Dream Walker. One night, Ren had a dream unlike any before. He stood in a golden field beneath a sky that pulsed with light. A voice whispered riddles he couldn't quite grasp. He walked for what felt like days, barefoot, until he came to the edge of a quiet forest. There, a small gate waited, and beside it, his shoe soled, worn, just as he had left them before entering the dream. He bent down to put them on, but before his fingers touched the leather, he woke up. That morning, disturbed and breathless, Ren ran to the old master in the meditation hall. "The dream was so clear," he said. "I was close to something. The gate, the shoes. I almost understood." The master poured tea, then said softly, "Tell me, Ren, where are your shoes now?" Ren looked down. They were beside him, damp with dew from his run through the garden. The master smiled. "Good, you brought them back, but do not chase the dream. Sometimes the shoes left behind are the sign that it's time to wake up." Ren sat quietly. He realized he had been trying to live inside the dream, not beside it. That his longing for meaning had become another form of sleep. He gently removed his shoes, set them at the door, and entered the meditation hall barefoot. Moral of the story: peace is not found in the dreams we chase, but in the moment we return to ourselves. When we stop trying to carry the illusion into waking life, we make space for presence. And in that quiet space, the world no longer needs to whisper, we are already listening. The next story is called The Last Footprint Before Awakening. This story teaches about effort, surrender, and the mysterious moment when the path disappears beneath your feet because you no longer need it. It reminds us that awakening is not a place we arrive, but a state we enter when we've finally stopped trying to reach something outside ourselves. Sometimes, peace comes just after the final step, the one we stop trying to take. In a distant valley wrapped in mist and silence, there was an old pilgrim's trail leading up to a small mountain shrine. It was said that those who reached the top, after walking the path with full presence, might glimpse a truth that could not be spoken. No signs marked the way, only stones smoothed by generations of bare feet. A young seeker named Mika came to walk it. She was quiet, determined, and had carried the question of awakening in her heart for many years. "I must find it," she whispered as she began, "even if it takes my whole life." Each day, she took careful steps. She listened to birds, noticed shadows, bowed to flowers that grew through cracks. And yet, even as her steps became softer, her longing remained sharp. Where is the answer? When will I arrive? After weeks of walking, her feet bleeding and her spirit tired, Mika reached a clearing near the top of the trail. There, in the still mud beneath a tree, was a single footprint, perfect, unmoving, as if left just moments before. It pointed forward, toward a patch of untrodden grass, but there were no more footprints ahead. Mika waited, expecting someone to return, to explain. No one came. The trees whispered. The wind passed through her sleeves. She looked down at the footprint, then to the sky. "Is this it?" she asked softly. No answer came, just the silence of everything. Then a thought arose, not like a voice, but like a ripple in still water. There is no final step, only the moment you stop needing to take one. Mika sat beside the footprint. For the first time, she was not reaching forward. She was simply present. And in that stillness, something inside her arrived. Moral of the story: the path to peace is walked step by step, but awakening comes when you stop searching for it to appear ahead. Sometimes the last footprint is not the one you make, but the one you rest beside. The journey ends not with a destination, but with stillness. The next story is called When Mountains Forgot Their Names. This story speaks of identity, ego, and the deep stillness that arises when we no longer need to define ourselves or anything at all. It reminds us that peace is not found in who we think we are, but in what remains when even names dissolve. True calm is not the result of knowing, but of being without clinging. In a distant valley cradled between ancient peaks, a Zen master named Ansei lived alone among the cliffs. The villagers below called the mountains by names passed down for generations: Mount Crane, Mount Turtle, Mount Fire. To them, each peak had a personality, a legend, a meaning. One day, a traveler arrived in the valley. He had climbed many sacred mountains across the land, seeking wisdom from those who lived closest to the sky. He asked the villagers, "Where can I find Master Ansei?" They pointed upward. "He lives beyond Mount Fire, near the Twin Ridges." The traveler climbed, hour after hour, until the landscape around him grew quiet and strange. The wind carried no stories. The trees seemed to listen rather than speak. He found the old master sitting by a spring, eyes closed, unmoved by the approach of footsteps. "Master Ansei," the traveler said, bowing, "I have come far. I've studied sutras, debated names and meanings. Please, what is the name of the mountain on which we now stand?" Ansei opened his eyes, soft and clear. "This mountain," he said, "has forgotten its name." The traveler looked puzzled. "How can a mountain forget its name?" "Because it never needed one," Ansei replied. "Only people give names, stories, identities. The mountain has only ever stood in silence." The traveler sat down, unsure of what to say. No words came. Only wind, only stone, only the sound of water trickling nearby. And in that stillness, something inside him loosened. He felt himself not as a seeker, not as a traveler, not even as a name, but simply as presence, resting alongside the mountain that was, and needed no title to be real. Moral of the story: peace begins when we stop naming everything, even ourselves. When we release the need to define, to be someone, to understand everything by label, we return to pure being. The mountain does not know it is a mountain. It simply stands. And in its nameless stillness, it is complete. The next story is called The Master Who Slept on Blossoms. This story teaches the power of surrender, lightness, and the gentle freedom that comes when we stop struggling with life and begin to rest within it. It reminds us that peace is not earned by effort alone. It blooms when we allow ourselves to soften, to trust, and to simply lie down in the moment we're already in. In the southern mountains, where plum trees covered the hillsides like clouds of white and pink, there lived an old Zen master named Anju. He was known not for great teachings or temples, but for how he moved through the world, slowly, lightly, as if his feet barely touched the ground. Villagers said he could sleep anywhere, on moss, on rooftops, even on stones. But his favorite place was beneath the blossoms in spring. Each year, when the petals began to fall, Master Anju would take a single blanket, walk into the orchard, and lie down beneath the trees. He didn't meditate, he didn't chant. He simply closed his eyes and slept, petals drifting down to cover him like snow. One spring, a novice monk named Riku came to him, worried and tired. "Master," Riku said, "I've followed all the teachings. I rise early, sit long, study hard. But still, I feel heavy. My thoughts never leave me. What more should I do?" Anju opened one eye and pointed to the sky. A soft breeze shook the branches. A shower of petals fell around them. "Do you see the blossoms?" he asked. Riku nodded. "Yes." "Are they trying to fall?" Riku paused. "No, they just fall." Anju smiled and closed his eyes again. "Then why do you struggle to land?" That night, Riku did not return to the temple. He stayed under the trees, lay down beside the master, and let his breath slow. The petals fell on his chest, his face, his hands. And in that softness, something inside him finally let go, not out of effort, but out of trust. Moral of the story: peace does not always come from striving. Sometimes it comes when we stop trying to hold ourselves up and instead let life hold us. Like blossoms that fall without fear, we too can find freedom not by reaching, but by resting. Not by force, but by allowing. The next story is called One Brushstroke Across the Void. This story speaks of courage, impermanence, and the quiet leap that art, truth, and life sometimes require. It teaches that peace is not in perfect preparation, but in the willingness to act with presence, even when the outcome is unknown. A single honest gesture made from stillness can cross the space between fear and freedom. In a cliffside temple where clouds often passed below the windows, there lived an old calligraphy master named Kuro. He had once been famous in the city, his scrolls treasured, his exhibitions full. But in his later years, he had withdrawn from fame and retreated to the mountains. There, he kept only one blank scroll. It hung on the wall for over 10 years, perfect, untouched, white as winter light. Students begged him to write on it, to offer one final piece to the world. "Not yet," he would say. "The void hasn't spoken." One day, a young student named Nari came to him with urgency in her voice. "Master," she said, "aren't you afraid time will pass and the scroll will remain empty?" Kuro smiled gently. "I'm not waiting to fill it, I'm waiting to meet it." That night, a storm rolled through the mountain. Wind shook the walls, thunder echoed in the valleys, and rain tapped the roof like a heartbeat. As the candle flickered low, Kuro rose quietly from his cushion. He stood before the scroll, dipped his brush in ink, and in one breath without hesitation dragged a single, fluid line across the paper. Not a word, not a symbol, just a brushstroke curving across the space like wind through sky. Then he bowed. In the morning, Nari returned and saw it. "Is it finished?" she asked. Kuro nodded. The void gave its shape. I only listened. Years later, that scroll hung in silence in a new temple. People came and stared, some confused, some moved to tears. But none could explain why. The brushstroke seemed to carry something vast: emptiness, fullness, and everything in between. Moral of the story: peace comes when we act not from fear, but from presence. We may not know what our gesture will mean, but when it's made from stillness, it echoes. One brushstroke, honest and unforced, can cross the void between doubt and truth, and leave behind a silence more beautiful than words. The next story is called The Garden That Vanished in Rain. This story speaks of impermanence, devotion, and the quiet grace of letting go. It teaches that peace is not in preserving what fades, but in loving it fully while it lasts. When beauty dissolves, it doesn't mean it was wasted, it means it was real. And sometimes that's enough. On the outskirts of a mountain temple lived a monk named Sore, known for creating gardens unlike any other. But his gardens were not made of stone, or trimmed hedges, or raked gravel. They were drawn on earth with colored sand, ash, petals, and powdered leaves. He spent hours, even days, arranging them by hand into spirals, waves, and mandalas no larger than a blanket. And always, when he finished, he bowed once, then left it alone. He never tried to preserve his work. He never enclosed it with rope or warned the others to be careful. He simply let it be. One summer afternoon, as clouds gathered over the hills, a young monk named Kaoru came to Sore's latest designer, beautiful circle of crimson and gold, made entirely from crushed flower petals. Kaoru's breath caught in his throat. "This is too perfect to be left out in the weather," he said. "We must cover it, or move it, or at least protect it." Sore smiled, kneeling beside him. "The garden is not made to last. It's made to be seen once, completely." Kaoru frowned. "But what if the rain comes?" "Then the rain becomes part of the garden too." That evening, the storm came. Heavy drops fell like hands from the sky. By morning, the petals were gone. A soft blur of color remained, smudged into the mud. The design had vanished. Kaoru stood in silence, a sadness rising in him. But then he noticed something. Sore was smiling. "Do you not mourn it?" Kaoru asked. Sore closed his eyes and whispered, "I loved it while it lived, and now I love that it's gone." Moral of the story: peace comes when we stop trying to keep beauty from fading. What is temporary is not broken, it is precious. To love something fully, knowing it will vanish, is not sorrow. It is freedom. When the rain washes away the garden, it doesn't erase its truth, it completes it. The next story is called A Cup of Snow for the Hungry Ghost. This story speaks of compassion, impermanence, and the quiet offering we can make even when what we give seems to vanish. It reminds us that peace does not come from fixing every sorrow or solving every hunger, but from showing up with gentleness, even when we know what we give may melt away. In a valley where winter lasted longer than spring, a wandering monk named Tetsu made his home beneath a grove of leafless trees. The villagers nearby spoke of hungry ghost spirits with thin necks and wide bellies, cursed to wander the world with endless longing. Every year, during the coldest month, they said the ghosts passed through the valley, searching for warmth, food, or forgiveness. One snowy morning, Tetsu awoke early and stepped outside. Snow blanketed the earth, pure and silent. He sat in meditation as the sky turned pale grey. At noon, he rose, went to his hut, and returned with an empty teacup. Kneeling in the snow, he gently scooped it, full packing it softly, not too tight, and placed it on a smooth stone near the edge of the trees. A young traveler watching from the trail called out, "Why offer snow? It will melt. The ghosts cannot drink it." Tetsu looked up, eyes soft. "Yes, and flowers wilt, and words fade. But the offering is not for the hunger, it's for the moment we remember they exist." The traveler fell silent. That evening, the snow began to fall again. The cup overflowed, then disappeared beneath the white. But Tetsu left it untouched. The next morning, only a small hollow remained like a memory, gently held. And the traveler, long after continuing his journey, found himself remembering that cup not because it filled the ghost's belly, but because it filled something in his heart. Moral of the story: peace does not come from permanence, but from presence. What we give may not last, may not even be used. But when we offer with awareness and love, even a cup of snow to an invisible guest, we touch something eternal. In that fleeting gesture, compassion lives. The next story is called The Monk Who Breathed Once Per Hour. This story teaches the power of presence, deep patience, and the extraordinary calm that arises when we fully inhabit a single breath. It reminds us that peace is not in slowing time, but in entering it so completely that each moment becomes eternal. In stillness, even one breath can hold a lifetime. Far beyond the crowded temples and dusty paths of the cities, high in the snowy mountains where only wind and ravens visited, there lived a solitary monk named Tenzin. Many believed he was a mythic figure whispered about in tea-houses and scroll margins. They called him the monk who breathed once per hour. Pilgrims would sometimes climb the treacherous path to find him. Most turned back. Some made it to the final cliff, where they found a small stone hut, half buried in snow, and beside it, a sitting figure motionless, cloaked in silence. One spring, a young monk named Haru reached the hut after 7 days of climbing. He had questions burning in him about time, effort, peace, and the meaning of life. When he found Tenzin, he expected great words. But the old monk simply sat, eyes open, unmoving, as if sculpted from the rock itself. Haru sat beside him. Minutes passed, then hours. The air was still. The sound of snow melting from the cliffs echoed faintly, and then it happened. A breath, so slow, so deep, like the wind circling inside a cave. And with it, Haru felt something shift in the world around him, like everything had slowed to match that single inhale. His own breath, once fast and shallow, softened. His thoughts quieted. No one had spoken, yet everything was being said. When the sun began to set, Haru whispered, "How do you do it? How do you breathe so slowly?" Tenzin turned his head slightly and said just one thing, "I do not slow the breath. I simply stop being in a hurry to live." Haru said nothing. He didn't need to. He closed his eyes, placed a hand on his chest, and waited not for answers, but for the next breath to come. Moral of the story: peace is not found by rushing through life. It is found when we finally rest inside one breath. When we stop chasing the next moment, time opens. And in that space, the breath becomes not a means to survive, but a place to be. The next story is called Zazen, Beneath the Cracked Gong. This story teaches us that peace does not depend on perfection. It reminds us that broken things still carry sound, and a quiet mind does not come from fixing the world around us, but from sitting fully in the middle of it, flawed, incomplete, and beautiful in its honesty. In the meditation hall of an old temple by the sea, the main gong had cracked many years ago. No one knew how. Some said it had fallen during a storm, others said it had split during a lightning strike. What remained was a wide bronze circle with a long, uneven scar down its center, still hanging, still used. Each morning, a monk struck it once before zazen. The sound was stranjano, longer, deep and perfect, but uneven, trembling, almost human. Some newer monks disliked it. They longed for a clean note, a perfect chime to mark the beginning of silence. But the abbot, Master Keiji, insisted it remain. One day, a young monk named Daigo asked, "Why do we still use a broken gong, Master? Doesn't it disturb the silence?" Keiji looked at him and said softly, "Do your thoughts ever come in perfect shape?" Daigo looked down. "No, Master." "Does your breath always arrive evenly, without pause, without wait?" "No." Keiji turned toward the gong. "Then why should the bell be different from the one who listens?" That morning, Daigo sat beneath the cracked gong for zazen. When it was struck, the sound shivered through the hall. It didn't echo with power. It wavered, as if unsure. But as it faded, Daigo felt something inside him mirror the sound, imperfect, soft, honest. The silence that followed was deeper than any before. Not because it was flawless, but because it welcomed everything, even the fracture. Years later, the gong still hung, still cracked, and it rang every morning to remind the monks, sit not because everything is fixed, but because you are willing to be still within what is broken. Moral of the story: peace is not found in what is flawless. It is found in sitting with the cracks, the scars, the trembling sounds. When we stop waiting for perfection, even a broken gong can call us into the deepest silence. The next story is called Wind That Recited the Heart Sutra. This story teaches the deep harmony between nature and the Dharma, and how the teachings of awakening are not bound by voice, language, or ink. It reminds us that peace is not only something to be learned, but something already spoken, constantly, by the world itself. To hear it, we only need to become quiet enough to listen. In a small temple perched on the edge of a cliff, where pine trees bowed to the sea and mist rose like incense from the rocks below, there lived an old monk named Shoen. He had long ago stopped giving lectures or writing sutras. Instead, each morning, he would sit alone beneath the tall trees, facing the ocean winds. When asked why he never taught the Heart Sutra aloud, the most sacred of all Zen texts, only smiled and said, "I no longer need to." The younger monks were puzzled. They had memorized every word of the sutra, chanting it daily with careful rhythm. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. But Shoen said nothing. He just listened. One day, a skeptical scholar from the capital came to visit. He had heard of the silent monk who claimed to hear sutras in the wind. "Master," he said, "surely the wind cannot speak. You say you no longer recite the Heart Sutra. How, then, do you practice?" Shoen gestured to the trees. The wind moved through the needles with a slow breath, then swirled down through the garden stones, brushing against the scholar's robe. "Do you hear it?" the master asked. "I hear only wind." Shoen nodded. "Yes, that is the first line." Confused, the scholar stayed for several days, watching the master sit silently beneath the trees, never once opening his mouth to teach. But on the fourth day, as the wind danced through the forest, something changed. The sound was not different, but he was. Each rustling branch, each trembling reed, seemed to echo a line he had studied before. The world was chanting, without voice, without effort. And in that moment, he wept not from sorrow, but from recognition. Moral of the story: The Dharma is not just written, it is breathed. When the mind becomes quiet, even the wind speaks truth. Peace comes not from repeating the words, but from hearing them everywhere. When we truly listen, we find the Heart Sutra already whispered by the trees, the waves, the wind, and our own stillness. The next story is called Master Teshin's Sandals of Silence. This story teaches the quiet strength of humility, presence, and the way peace walks through the world without needing recognition or praise. It reminds us that true stillness is not what we say or teach, but how we move through each moment, step by step, leaving no trace but calm. Master Teshin never announced himself. He entered every room without sound, every path without footprints. While others wore polished sandals or heavy robes that signaled their rank, Teshin walked in old straw sandals that barely clung to his feet, thin, frayed, and silent. He never gave public talks. He never wrote teachings on scrolls. But when he passed through the temple courtyard, conversations softened. When he swept the steps at dawn, even the sparrows seemed to quiet. One afternoon, a proud young monk named Jiro approached him. Jiro had memorized hundreds of sutras, debated with great teachers, and worn sandals so firm that their thudding could be heard from across the hall. "Master Teshin," he said, "I wish to understand your teaching. You do not speak, and yet others follow you. What is it that you give them?" Teshin paused, looked down at his worn sandals, and took them off. He handed them to Jiro and said, "Walk to the bell tower and return." Confused but obedient, Jiro slipped them on and walked away. With each step, he felt the ground-cool stones, loose dust, edges of leaves. The silence was deep, almost unsettling. No sound of heels, no echo of movement. It was as if he had vanished from the world, yet was touching it more than ever before. When he returned, Teshin asked, "What did you learn?" Jiro bowed slowly. "I learned that silence walks differently. It listens, not declares." Teshin only nodded, taking back the sandals with a soft smile. He placed them by the door, worn soles facing the garden. From that day on, Jiro's steps grew softer. He said less, and when he did speak, it came from a place deeper than knowledge, closer to peace. Moral of the story: peace is not loud. It doesn't seek attention. It moves through the world like worn sandals, quiet, soft, present. When we let go of the need to prove or declare, we begin to walk in silence. And in that silence, others feel the truth without a single word. The next story is called The Invisible Bell Tower. This story teaches about inner awareness, quiet discipline, and the truth that the most important signals in life are not always seen or heard but felt. It reminds us that peace does not come from being told when to act or pause. It comes when we learn to hear the silent bell already ringing within. In a peaceful valley temple, nestled between two slow rivers, the monks lived by the sound of a great bronze bell. It stood in a tall wooden tower at the temple's center, its deep tones guiding the day, waking the monks, calling them to meals, marking the start and end of zazen. But one year, after a long and rainy season, lightning struck the bell tower during a storm. The wood burned to the ground, and the bell fell, cracked and silent. The monks gathered around the ashes, unsure what to do. Some said they should build a new tower, others argued they must cast a new bell. But the abbot only swept the ground and said, "No need, let the bell remain as it is." "But how will we know when to rise, to sit, to bow?" a novice asked. The abbot pointed to the sky. "The sun still moves, the breath still comes. The bell was never the master, it was only the reminder." From then on, there were no bells, no chimes, no sound to guide them. And yet, something strange happened. The monks still rose at dawn. They still gathered to sit in perfect silence. They still moved as one meals, chants, bowing without being called. Visitors were astonished. "How do you know when it's time?" One monk answered softly, "We each became the bell." Years passed. Grass grew where the tower once stood. The cracked bell remained half buried in moss, never rung again. But the temple became more peaceful than ever, as if the silence of the bell had tuned the entire valley into stillness. Moral of the story: peace comes when we stop waiting for signs from the outside. The world may fall silent, but if we learn to listen inwardly, the bell never stops ringing. Discipline born from awareness needs no tower, no sound-only presence. When we become still enough, we find the guidance was always within. The next story is called "The Zen Scroll Never Opened." This story teaches the value of presence over knowledge, of being over knowing. It reminds us that true peace is not found in what we read, study, or chase with the mind, but in what we are willing to sit with quietly, completely, without needing more. Some of the deepest truths arrive not through answers, but through the space left for them. In a mountain temple covered by drifting mist, there was a scroll said to contain the final teaching of a revered Zen master. It was kept in a lacquered box on a stone pedestal, wrapped in silk, untouched for over 50 years. None of the monks had read it. None had dared. The story went that the master wrote it just before his death and said, "This teaching needs no eyes." The scroll became a symbol of mystery. New monks came, tempted by it. Some sat in meditation before it for weeks. Others dreamed of opening it, hoping to uncover the one teaching that would make everything clear. One day, a curious monk named Jun stood before it in the early light. He had studied deeply, but peace still escaped him. His heart ached with longing. He stared at the box and whispered, "Will this scroll finally quiet my mind?" He turned to the abbot, who stood nearby, raking the gravel garden. "Master, why has no one opened it?" The abbot looked up, his hands still. "Because opening it would close something else." Jun frowned. "Close what?" "The question," said the abbot. "The openness, the stillness that lives in not knowing. That scroll has already given its teaching by never being read." Jun sat down in front of it. He watched the morning light fall across the box. He listened to the wind moving past the paper walls. And slowly, the desire to know softened. For the first time, he didn't reach. He just stayed. And in that quiet, without answers, something opened inside him wider than words, deeper than any scroll. Moral of the story: peace is not always found in what we open, but in what we are willing to leave closed. The mind hungers for answers, but the heart knows presence. Sometimes, the greatest teaching is the one that waits in silence and is never unwrapped. The next story is called "A Single Thread from Heaven's Robe." This story teaches about humility, grace, and the quiet gift of receiving what we do not deserve but are ready for. It reminds us that peace often arrives not in grand visions or loud blessings, but in small, delicate moments, subtle enough to miss, but powerful enough to change us forever. All it takes is being present when the thread touches the heart. Long ago, in a forgotten corner of a mountain temple, lived an old seamstress named Kana. She was not a monk, nor a teacher. Her job was simple. She mended robes, torn sleeves, worn hems, loose threads. She worked alone in silence, day after day, with needles and cloth, her hands steady even as her back bent with age. Kana had never read sutras. She had never spoken with the abbot. Some of the younger monks didn't even know her name. But whenever a robe needed care, it was she who made it whole again. One autumn, a robe came to her, unlike any she had ever seen. It had belonged to a wandering monk who had passed through only briefly and left it behind. The fabric was old but delicate, light as mist, and fraying along its edge. Kana held it in her hands and noticed a thread unlike the others, thin as breath, golden like morning. It shimmered faintly when the light touched it, as if woven from something not of this world. She tried to repair the edge, but the golden thread would not knot. It moved strangely, slipping through the cloth as if alive. Frustrated, Kana paused and whispered, "Why won't you hold still?" And in the silence that followed, she felt something shift, not in the cloth but in her. The room grew still. Her breath slowed, her hands softened. She stopped trying to control the thread and simply followed it gently, with reverence, like tracing a path laid by stars. The robe mended itself, not by force, but through grace. When it was done, Kana sat back. Her hands trembled. She had no words, no understanding, only a stillness that reached to the bottom of her heart. She never saw the thread again. But from that day on, she smiled differently, walked differently, as if something light had been sewn into her too. Moral of the story: peace often enters through the smallest places. We do not always recognize grace when it arrives. It may come as a thread, a moment, a whisper. But when we stop trying to grasp it and simply follow with presence, we are quietly stitched into something greater. Even a single thread, if we're ready, can mend the soul. The next story is called The Novice Who Answered with a Feather. This story speaks of simplicity, stillness, and the wisdom that flows when we stop speaking from the mind and begin responding from the heart. It reminds us that peace does not come from cleverness or intellect, but from a quiet, intuitive presence so light it barely touches the world, yet somehow moves it. In the courtyard of a forest temple, where the light filtered softly through the trees, Master Oryu gave his novices a weekly teaching. It was rarely formal, no scrolls, no lectures, just questions, scattered like seeds, left to bloom in silence. One morning, he held up a feather, a soft, white plume from a crane that had passed overhead the day before. He turned to his students and said, "This is today's koan. What is its answer?" The monks looked at one another, confused. A few stepped forward and offered responses. "It represents impermanence," said one. "No, it is a symbol of emptiness, something that has no weight," said another. "It's a message from nature," a third added. Master Oryu said nothing. The feather drifted slightly in the breeze, trembling but never falling. Then the youngest novice, a quiet boy named Soma, stepped forward. He had never spoken during the lessons. He didn't say a word now either. He simply walked up to the feather in the master's hand, took a deep breath, and gently blew on it. The feather lifted, floated, and danced into the air. The entire courtyard watched it spin, rise, and fall graceful, effortless, silent. Oryu smiled. "That," he said, "is the answer." The other monks looked stunned. "But—" He didn't say anything. "No," Oryu replied, "because truth doesn't always need words." His response carried no theory, no ego, just presence and release. That day, no one spoke further. They sat under the trees, watching the feather rest on the grass, its message already delivered. Moral of the story: peace is not something to explain, it is something to feel, to offer, to let go of. The wisest answers often make no sound. When we stop trying to prove what we know, we make space for something far more powerful to rise: stillness, breath, and the beauty of a single feather floating through the moment. The next story is called Footsteps That Never Arrived. This story speaks of expectation, illusion, and the subtle fear of what might come. It teaches that much of our suffering comes not from what is, but from what we imagine. True peace comes when we stop waiting for what never arrives and instead rest in the stillness that has always been here. In a monastery on the edge of a dense bamboo forest, the monks lived in quiet rhythm, chanting, cooking, meditating. The days passed with the hush of falling leaves. But one winter evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, something changed. It began with a sound soft, steady, unmistakable, footsteps on gravel. They came from the forest path leading toward the temple, slow, purposeful, one step at a time. A young monk named Genji looked up from his evening cleaning. He heard it too. "Someone is coming," he said. Others nodded. The footsteps grew closer. They paused, then continued. The abbot came to the entrance and stood silently, listening. The monks gathered, waiting for the visitor. No one ever arrived this late. No messenger had been sent. No guest was expected. But still, the footsteps kept coming. Then they stopped. The monks opened the gate. No one was there. They stepped outside, checked the path, the trees, the shadows. Nothing, only silence. The air was still, the gravel untouched. No sign of anyone. The monks looked to the abbot, uneasy. "Was it a ghost?" one whispered. "A spirit?" The abbot sat down calmly and said, "It was only the mind. Yours, mine, everyone's. Sometimes it walks toward you, full of stories, warnings, fears. But if you open the gate, you'll see there is no one there." That night, Genji couldn't sleep. He lay awake, waiting, listening. But the footsteps never returned. In the morning, he went outside, barefoot, and walked the same path slowly, one step at a time. And with each footfall, he let go of one worry, one expectation, one imagined visitor. By the end, he was alone and at peace. Moral of the story: not every sound in the mind is a truth. Not every fear needs to be opened. Often, the footsteps we hear are echoes of our own thoughts coming closer, only because we expect them. Peace begins when we stop waiting for what never comes, and finally step fully into what's already here. The next story is called The Stone Buddha's Smile at Dusk. This story teaches us about stillness, time, and the quiet radiance that emerges when we are fully at peace with what is. It reminds us that true serenity doesn't shine in the heat of day, but glows gently as the world softens when ambition fades, when the light grows long, and we finally sit, like stone, without trying to be anything else. On the edge of a village, where tall grass met the forest path, there stood an old stone Buddha. Weathered by wind, chipped by rain, covered in moss, it had no shrine, no candles, no incense, just presence. Some villagers bowed as they passed. Others barely noticed. It did not matter to the statue. It had been sitting there for centuries. Children climbed it in spring. Snow covered it in winter. Birds landed on its head. It never changed except at dusk. Each evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, something subtle would happen. The way the light touched the stone made it look as if the Buddha was smiling. Not widely, not obviously, but just enough for those who paused to notice. One day, a monk traveling through the village stopped by the statue. He sat in the tall grass beside it, watching the light shift. A young girl from the village approached, curious. "Why do you sit with the statue?" she asked. "It does nothing." The monk smiled and said, "That's why I sit with it." She tilted her head. "But it's just stone." He nodded. "Yes, and yet it smiles every evening, not because it wants to, but because it simply allows the light to find it." The girl sat beside him. They watched in silence as the sun touched the statue's cheek. For a brief moment, the stone seemed warm, alive, gentle. No words were needed. They stayed until the last light faded and the smile vanished into shadow, but its presence remained felt more than seen. Moral of the story: peace does not need to be loud or constant. Like the stone Buddha, it waits patiently, unmoving, until the light of awareness reveals its quiet smile. We do not have to chase it. We only have to sit still long enough to let it appear, especially at dusk, when the world is ready to soften. In the quiet breath of a bamboo grove, in a single brushstroke, in the hush between footsteps, You've walked through stories not meant to impress, but to soften. From empty teacups and cracked gongs to unread scrolls and featherlight answers, each tale opened a small door to peace, reminding you that stillness lives not in what you chase, but in how you pause. These weren't just stories, they were mirrors, whispers, moments. Each one a gentle nudge toward the place where calm already exists, within you. If one of these moments touched you, even quietly leave a comment below. Tell us which story stayed with you, which one helped you breathe a little deeper. Sometimes the calm you share becomes someone else's beginning. And if you'd like to carry this stillness with you a little longer, subscribe to the channel. More stories, more silence, more space for you to come back to anytime you need to return to yourself. Thank you for sitting with us.